Some mountains refuse to be measured twice the same way. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex sprawls across more than 1 million acres of northwestern Montana, a fortress of limestone peaks, glacial valleys, and forests so dense that even seasoned backcountry rangers admit there are sections they've never walked. The Chinese Wall, a sheer escarpment running nearly 13 miles along the Continental Divide, is its most dramatic feature. It rises like a geological scar, a 1,000-foot cliff face that geologists believe formed over 70 million years ago. The wall has been surveyed, photographed, and mapped dozens of times since the early 1900s. By 1967, its dimensions were considered settled fact. That summer, the U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a team of 4 cartographers to update topographic maps of the region using new theodolite technology. The crew consisted of Martin Aldrich, the lead surveyor, Rebecca Fontaine, a geologist from the University of Montana, James Kurokawa, a junior technician, and Samuel Greenwood, a contracted guide familiar with the wall's remote trails. They flew into Schaefer Meadows by bush plane in late June, carrying equipment that weighed over 300 pounds. The assignment was routine: verify existing elevation data, document any erosion or geological shifts, and produce updated contour maps for the Forest Service. The anomaly appeared on the 3rd day. Aldrich and Fontaine were stationed at a benchmark near the base of the wall, a bronze disc embedded in bedrock during a 1923 survey. The disc's elevation had been recorded at 7,214 feet above sea level. When they calibrated their instruments and began taking measurements, the readings didn't match. The new elevation registered 7,416 feet, 202 feet higher than every prior survey. Aldrich assumed instrument error. He recalibrated. He checked the level. He consulted the original survey notes, which Fontaine had brought in a weathered leather binder. The benchmark hadn't moved. The bedrock showed no signs of uplift or tectonic disturbance. Yet the instruments insisted the elevation had changed. They moved to a second benchmark, half a mile south. Same result, 200 feet higher than recorded. Then a third site, same discrepancy. By the end of the day, they had rechecked 7 separate benchmarks along a 4-mile stretch of the wall. All showed the same impossible gain in elevation. Kurokawa, the technician, suggested atmospheric interference. Fontaine ruled it out. The weather was clear, barometric pressure stable. Greenwood, the guide, said nothing, but his expression suggested he wasn't surprised. Over the next 11 days, the team expanded their survey. They used 2 different theodolites, a level transit, and handheld altimeters. They cross-referenced their findings with triangulation points established by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1941. The results were consistent. Every measurement indicated the Chinese Wall was 200 feet taller than it had been for the past 44 years. Fontaine began taking soil and rock samples. She documented no volcanic activity, no fault movement, no subsidence in surrounding areas. The limestone strata matched photographs from previous geological studies. The wall had not grown. It had not moved. Yet the instruments said otherwise. On the night of July 8th, Aldrich wrote in his field journal, "We are measuring something that does not exist, or we are failing to measure what does. I don't know which is worse." When the team returned to Schaefer Meadows on July 14th to resupply, they filed a preliminary report with the regional USGS office in Helena. The report was brief and carefully worded. It noted significant discrepancies in elevation data and requested a secondary survey team to verify findings. The request was approved. A second crew was scheduled to arrive in early August. That second team was led by Gordon Whitlock, a senior cartographer with 18 years of field experience. He brought more advanced equipment, including an early laser rangefinder and a portable radio theodolite. The crew retraced Aldrich's route, reoccupied the same benchmarks, and conducted measurements over a 5-day period, beginning August 4th. Their findings matched the original surveys from 1923. The Chinese wall measured 7,214 feet. No discrepancy. No 200-foot anomaly. Whitlock's notes, later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, included a single typed sentence. Aldrich team data cannot be replicated under identical conditions. Aldrich was recalled to Helena for review. He brought his instruments, his notes, and Fontaine's geological samples. During the debriefing, he insisted the measurements were accurate. He offered to return to the wall and repeat the survey. His request was denied. Fontaine corroborated his account in a separate interview, noting that all 4 team members had witnessed the same readings on multiple instruments over multiple days. Kurokawa and Greenwood provided written statements supporting Aldrich's report. The USGS opened an internal investigation. Instruments were tested and found to be functioning correctly. Field notes were reviewed for procedural errors. None were found. Atmospheric data from the period showed no unusual weather patterns. Seismic records indicated no geological activity in the region. In November of 1967, the investigation was quietly closed. The official conclusion, documented in a 3-page memo stamped "For internal use only," stated that the discrepancies were likely caused by cumulative operator error and environmental factors not fully understood at the time of survey. Aldrich was reassigned to a cartographic analysis position in Washington, D.C. Fontaine returned to teaching. Kurokawa left the USGS the following year. Greenwood continued guiding in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, but refused to discuss the survey in interviews. No further attempts were made to resurvey the Chinese wall until 1979, when a joint USGS and National Park Service team conducted aerial photogrammetry. The wall's elevation was confirmed at 7,214 feet. It has remained consistent in every survey since. But Aldrich never accepted the findings. After his death in 2003, his daughter donated his personal papers to the Montana Historical Society. Among them was his original field journal from the 1967 survey. The final entry, dated July 13th, read, "The mountain corrected itself. I don't know what we measured, but it knew we were watching." In 2009, a wilderness permits clerk in Kalispell discovered something unusual while digitizing old backcountry records. Between July 1st and July 14th of 1967, 6 separate hiking parties reported experiencing severe compass malfunctions along the Chinese wall. All 6 groups described their compasses spinning or refusing to settle on a consistent bearing. The reports were filed, logged, and forgotten. Greenwood, the guide, died in 2016. A year later, his grandson found a handwritten note tucked inside a geology textbook in Greenwood's cabin. The note, undated, read, "The old people said the wall walks at night. I never believed them, until Aldrich." The Chinese wall still stands. It still measures 7,214 feet. Hikers walk beneath it every summer, unaware that for 11 days in 1967, the instruments insisted it was somewhere else, somewhere 200 feet higher. And then it came back. There are places where sound goes to die. Kintla Lake sits in the remote northwestern corner of Glacier National Park, accessible only by a 12-mile dirt road that winds through dense lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The lake stretches nearly 7 miles, bordered by mountains that rise sharp and sudden from the water's edge. It's one of the least visited areas of the park. Fewer than 3,000 people hike its trails each year. The northern shore, where the trail narrows and the forest closes in, sees even less traffic. Park records show that between 1975 and 2010, an average of only 47 overnight permits were issued annually for campsites along that stretch. The lake was named by fur trappers in the 1800s, though the Kootenai people had known it long before. Early maps labeled it simply as Upper Lake. By the time Glacier became a national park in 1910, The name Kintla had stuck. The Forest Service built a primitive ranger station near the southern shore in 1929. It operated seasonally until 1968, when staffing was reduced. By 1981, the station had been converted to a storage shed. The northern shore has no facilities. No campsites are marked on current maps within a specific half-mile section of shoreline, though the trail passes directly through it. Hikers use the area as a rest stop or turnaround point. Some continue north toward the Canadian border, most don't. The first documented report came in August of 1981. A geology graduate student named Angela Howell was conducting a solo survey of glacial sediment deposits along the lake's northern perimeter. She had been hiking for 3 days, carrying soil samples and a tape recorder for field notes. On the afternoon of August 9th, she stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop approximately 4 miles from the trailhead. She sat down, opened her water bottle, and pressed record on her tape recorder to log observations. What she recorded was 4 minutes and 18 seconds of silence. Not quiet, silence. When she played the tape back that evening at her campsite, she heard nothing. No wind, no bird song, no rustling of her pack, no sound of her own breathing. She replayed it twice. The tape ran without interruption, but captured no audio. She assumed the recorder had malfunctioned. She noted the incident in her field journal and continued her work. 2 days later, she returned to the same spot to collect additional samples. She brought a second tape recorder, freshly tested. She sat in the exact location, pressed record, and spoke aloud, describing the sediment layers visible in the outcrop. She clapped her hands. She tapped a rock against her metal canteen. She heard nothing, not while recording. While she was sitting there, performing these actions, she heard nothing. No echo from the clap, no metallic ring from the canteen, no sound of her own voice. She stood up and walked 10 paces east. Sound returned: wind in the pines, the distant lap of water against the shore, the crunch of gravel under her boots. She walked back to the outcrop. Silence. She tested the boundaries. The zone measured roughly 60 feet in diameter, centered on the outcrop. Within that circle, auditory input ceased entirely. Outside it, sound behaved normally. The transition was immediate, not gradual, not fading, but a hard line where sound stopped. Howell filed a report with the Parks Resource Management Office in West Glacier. She included her tape recordings, her field notes, and a hand-drawn map marking the location. The report was logged and forwarded to the Chief Ranger's office. No follow-up was conducted that year. In July of 1983, a family of 4 from Spokane, David and Marianne Kowalski, and their 2 teenage sons stopped for lunch near the northern shore of Kintla Lake. They were approximately halfway through a day hike to Boulder Pass. Marianne later told a park ranger that while they were eating, her younger son tried to call to his brother, who was skipping stones at the water's edge. He yelled twice, she said, but no sound came out. She thought he was joking. Then she tried to call out herself. Nothing. Her husband stood up and clapped his hands over his head. Silence. The experience lasted, by her estimate, about 90 seconds. Then her younger son screamed, and they all heard it sharp and sudden, as if sound had been turned back on. The family packed up immediately and returned to the trailhead. They reported the incident to a ranger at the Pole Bridge entrance station. The ranger wrote it down, but offered no explanation. Between 1983 and 2003, at least 16 separate reports were filed, describing similar experiences near the northern shore of Kintla Lake. The accounts varied in detail, but shared consistent elements: a specific geographic location, a sudden loss of all auditory input, durations ranging from 30 seconds to over 4 minutes, and an abrupt return of normal sound. Most witnesses described the silence as wrong or oppressive. Several mentioned a feeling of pressure in their ears, though no change in elevation or barometric conditions could account for it. In September of 2003, the National Park Service dispatched a 2-person research team to investigate Dr. Yuki Tanaka, an environmental acoustic specialist from Oregon State University, and Forest Service ecologist named Marcus Delgado, were tasked with documenting the phenomenon using sensitive recording equipment. They spent 6 days at Kintla Lake, focusing on the half-mile section identified in previous reports. Tanaka brought a portable sound level meter, a parabolic microphone, and a digital field recorder capable of capturing frequencies outside the normal human hearing range. Delgado set up motion-activated wildlife cameras to rule out animal behavior as a contributing factor. They hiked the trail multiple times, stopping at intervals to measure ambient noise levels. On the 4th day, they found it. The sound level meter registered 0 decibels within a circular area measuring approximately 72 feet across. Not low, 0. Tanaka tested the equipment. It functioned correctly outside the zone. Inside, it detected nothing: no wind, no insect activity, no electromagnetic interference. The parabolic microphone, designed to amplify distant sounds, picked up nothing. Delgado clapped, shouted, and dragged a stick across a tree trunk. The meter didn't register. Tanaka's field notes, obtained through a public records request in 2012, included this observation: the absence is absolute, not muffled or dampened, erased. They spent 2 more days attempting to record the phenomenon. The digital recorder captured flat silence, a digital void that audio engineers later described as impossible unless the device was off. But the recorder's internal timestamp confirmed it had been running. Delgado's wildlife cameras, positioned inside and outside the zone, recorded video with no corresponding audio track when aimed at the silent area. Tanaka and Delgado submitted a preliminary report to the NPS in October of 2003. The report documented the measurements, included audio samples, and recommended further study involving geophysicists and atmospheric scientists. The recommendation was noted, but not acted upon. Tanaka applied for a research grant to continue the investigation. The grant was denied. She attempted to publish her findings in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. The paper was rejected after peer review, with reviewers citing insufficient reproducibility and lack of theoretical framework. In 2007, the half-mile section of trail where the silence occurs was quietly omitted from updated Glacier National Park hiking maps. The trail itself still exists and remains open, but the specific area is no longer marked with distance indicators or geographic labels. When asked, park officials cited map simplification and budget constraints. Howell, the geology student who first reported the phenomenon, returned to Kintla Lake in 2009. She was by then a professor at Idaho State University. She hiked to the northern shore with a colleague and a handheld GPS unit. She found the outcrop. She sat down. She waited. Sound continued normally. She tried 3 more times over 2 days. The silence did not return, but other hikers still report it. In 2015, a solo backpacker named Jonas Falk posted on a wilderness forum that he'd experienced total auditory loss near Kintla's northern shore. He described it as lasting maybe 2 minutes and noted he'd felt a humming pressure in his skull. When other users asked for specifics, he stopped responding. In 2019, a trail journal left at the Polebridge Ranger Station contained an unsigned entry: no sound at Kintla, not quiet, gone, don't go alone. The NPS does not maintain a centralized database of such reports. Individual ranger stations file incident logs locally, and those logs are archived after 5 years. Most are not digitized. Requests for historical records are processed slowly, if at all. Tanaka retired in 2021. In her final published paper, on an unrelated topic, she included a single footnote. It referenced Kintla Lake and ended with this sentence: "Some acoustic anomalies resist explanation, not because we lack the tools to measure them, but because they refuse to be measured twice." The outcrop is still there. The trail still passes within 10 feet of it. Hikers rest there, eat lunch, take photographs. Most hear nothing unusual, but some do. And what they hear is the absence of everything. A silence so complete it feels like forgetting. Some forests refuse to stay still. Avalanche Creek flows down the western slope of the Continental Divide, cutting through a glacial valley that has changed little since the last ice age. The creek feeds Avalanche Lake, a turquoise basin surrounded by cliffs that rise nearly 2,000 feet. The trail to the lake is one of Glacier National Park's most popular day hikes, drawing over 50,000 visitors each summer. But half a mile below the lake, where the trail bends sharply east and the forest thickens, there is a grove that appears on no current park literature. It measures roughly 2 acres, bounded on 3 sides by dense undergrowth and on the 4th by the creek itself. The trees are lodgepole pines, their trunks straight and narrow, their bark marked by the small diamond-shaped scars typical of the species. Lodgepoles grow in predictable patterns. They colonize areas after fires, their cones opening only in extreme heat. They live for a century or more, grow to heights of 70 feet, and die standing, their wood too dense to rot quickly. They are stable. They are countable, until they're not. The grove was first inventoried in the spring of 1952 as part of a larger Forest Service study on post-fire succession. Glacier had experienced a series of wildfires in the 1930s and 40s, and the study aimed to track how lodgepole populations were recovering. A 3-person team, led by Ranger Thomas Erickson, was assigned to survey several groves along Avalanche Creek. The work was methodical. Each tree, above 6 inches in diameter, was marked with a small metal tag, numbered sequentially, and recorded in a field ledger. The grove near the trail bend contained 104 trees. Erickson's team spent an afternoon tagging each one, photographing the grove from multiple angles, and sketching a rough map showing tree positions relative to the creek and trail. The data was filed with the Regional Forest Service office in Kalispell. In the fall of 1953, Erickson returned to the grove as part of a follow-up survey. He brought the original ledger and expected to find the same 104 trees. Instead, he counted 111. He recounted, still 111. He checked the metal tags. The first 104 were present and accounted for, their numbers matching his ledger. But 7 additional trees, all mature lodgepoles between 8 and 12 inches in diameter, stood among them. These trees bore no tags. They had not been there the previous year. Erickson examined the ground around the new trees. No disturbance, no signs of recent planting. The root systems appeared well established. The bark weathered in a way that suggested decades of growth. He looked for stumps, thinking perhaps he had miscounted the first time, and some trees had been missed. He found none. He photographed the grove again and updated his map. The new trees were distributed throughout the grove, not clustered in any particular area. When he returned to the ranger station that evening, he made a note in his daily log. 7 untagged specimens. Origin unclear. In the summer of 1954, Erickson brought a colleague, Ranger Patricia Voss, to verify the count. They found 109 trees. 2 of the 7 new trees from the previous fall were gone. Not fallen, not cut, gone. No stumps, no saw marks, no root depressions in the soil. Voss suggested animal activity or disease, but there were no signs of either. The remaining trees appeared healthy. The forest floor was undisturbed. They tagged the 2 missing trees as absent in the ledger and noted the discrepancy. Over the next 5 years, Erickson and Voss returned to the grove at irregular intervals, sometimes twice a season, sometimes once a year. Each time, the count changed. Spring of 1955, 107 trees. Fall of 1955, 112 trees. Summer of 1956, 104 trees, the original number. Spring of 1957, 116 trees. Fall of 1957, 108 trees. Summer of 1958, 119 trees. Spring of 1959, 106 trees. The fluctuations defied explanation. Erickson began bringing other rangers to witness the counts. In 1956, he invited Howard Sung, a forest ecologist from the University of Montana, to examine the grove. Sung spent 3 days taking soil samples, examining tree rings from fallen branches, and mapping root structures using a hand auger. His report, submitted to the Forest Service in October of that year, noted no detectable pattern in tree distribution or mortality, and concluded that further botanical study is warranted. Voss kept detailed notes on each visit. She described the trees as unremarkable in appearance, but noted that the tagged trees, the original 104, never disappeared. Only the untagged ones came and went. She wrote in her personal journal, later donated to the Glacier National Park archives. It's as if the grove has a fixed population it wants to maintain, and adds or subtracts as needed. But that makes no sense. In the fall of 1958, Erickson attempted a more comprehensive survey. He brought a surveying transit and measured the exact position of each tree relative to fixed landmarks, a large boulder near the creek, and a distinctive lightning-scarred Douglas fir at the grove's northern edge. He recorded compass bearings and distances. He took photographs with a gridded backdrop to document spacing. When he returned in the spring of 1959, the grid didn't match. Trees that should have been 12 feet apart were now 15 feet apart. Trees that had been clustered near the creek were now scattered evenly throughout the grove. The positions had shifted, but the ground showed no signs of upheaval. The trees themselves appeared undisturbed, no tilted trunks, no exposed roots, no soil displacement. Erickson filed a formal report with the National Park Service in June of 1959. The report outlined 7 years of observations, included photographs, maps, and witness statements from 4 separate rangers. It requested funding for a multi-year study involving geologists, botanists, and possibly soil engineers. The report was reviewed by the regional NPS director and forwarded to the chief scientist's office in Washington. No response was issued. In January of 1960, Erickson was reassigned to a desk position in the park's administrative offices. Voss transferred to Yellowstone later that year. Howard Sung's botanical study was never published. When contacted by a local journalist in 1973, Sung said only that the data was inconclusive and declined further comment. In 1961, the grove near Avalanche Creek was quietly removed from Forest Service inventory maps. The trail remained on park maps, but the specific 2-acre area was left unmarked. No grid reference, no notation, no mention in trail guides. A handwritten note in the park's internal files, dated March of 1961 and signed by an unnamed administrator, read, "Further surveys not recommended. Area reclassified as general forest." The grove itself was not restricted. Hikers still passed within 50 feet of it. Some ventured in, curious about the dense cluster of lodgepoles. But official counts ceased. No rangers were assigned to monitor it. The original field ledgers were archived in a storage facility in Kalispell and later transferred to the National Archives in Denver, where they remain classified under Administrative Records Limited Access. In 1987, a graduate student named Felix Ortega was researching historical forest surveys for his thesis on fire ecology. He obtained copies of Erickson's reports through a Freedom of Information Act request. Intrigued, he hiked to the grove and conducted his own count. He found 98 trees. He returned 3 months later and counted 105. He noted the discrepancy in his thesis, but his advisor recommended removing the section, calling it anecdotal and unverifiable. Ortega complied. The section was cut. In 2004, A wildfire swept through parts of Glacier, including sections of the Avalanche Creek drainage. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming thousands of acres. When crews assessed the damage afterward, they found the grove untouched. The fire had burned to within 20 feet on all sides, scorching undergrowth and smaller trees. But the lodgepoles in the grove showed no char, no heat damage, no sign of exposure to flame. Fire behavior analysts noted the anomaly in their report, but offered no explanation beyond favorable wind patterns and natural fire breaks. The grove is still there. The trail still passes beside it. Hikers rest in its shade, unaware that for 7 years it refused to be counted the same way twice. Park maps no longer acknowledge it. The metal tags, if any remain, are hidden beneath decades of bark growth. But the trees are still there, or some of them are. And every spring, someone could walk in and count them. And every spring, the number might be different. Not because the forest is growing, not because it's dying, because it's deciding. Sometimes the airwaves carry messages no one sent. Cut Bank Pass sits at 7,300 feet, straddling the Continental Divide in the remote eastern section of Glacier National Park. The terrain is steep and exposed, a landscape of windswept ridges and glacial cirques where weather can shift from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. The Blackfeet Nation has maintained traditional connections to this land for centuries, long before it became part of the national park system in 1910. Even now, tribal members work as fire lookouts, trail crew supervisors, and forestry specialists in areas where their ancestors once hunted and conducted ceremonies. Cut Bank Pass itself is accessible only by a 7-mile trail that gains nearly 3,000 feet in elevation. Few hikers attempt it. The pass sees perhaps 200 visitors annually, most of them experienced mountaineers, heading toward Triple Divide Peak. There are no facilities, no ranger stations, and no reliable cell phone coverage. Radio communication, when necessary, relies on handheld VHF transceivers operating on Forest Service frequencies. The pass has a reputation, not in guidebooks or tourist materials, but among those who work there. Blackfeet forestry crews avoid camping near the ridgeline. They don't explain why to outsiders, but among themselves, they share stories. Stories about voices in the wind, about dreams that predict weather, about places where compasses spin. These aren't discussed with park officials. They're simply known. In early July of 1978, a 4-person Blackfeet forestry crew was dispatched to Cut Bank Pass to assess fire risk and clear deadfall from a section of trail damaged during the previous winter. The crew consisted of Louis Whitecalf, the crew lead, his cousin Raymond Tailfeathers, and 2 younger workers, Gerald Running Crane and Teresa Morning Owl. They carried standard equipment, hand tools, climbing rope, first aid supplies, and 2 Motorola HT 220 handheld radios for emergency communication with the ranger station at Street Mary, 12 miles northeast. They established a base camp just below the pass on July 6th and began work the following morning. The radios were tested daily at noon and 6 in the evening, per standard protocol. Communication was clear. Weather was stable. The work proceeded without incident. On July 9th, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, both radios began emitting a tone. Whitecalf described it in his incident report as low and steady, like a hum, but with a pulse. The tone was audible through the radio's speaker, even when the device was turned off. Tailfeathers confirmed this detail. He had powered down his radio completely, removed the battery, and the tone continued for several seconds before fading. They assumed equipment malfunction. Whitecalf attempted to contact the Street Mary station. The tone persisted, overriding all other frequencies. He tried switching channels. The tone remained constant across the entire VHF band. Running Crane checked his wristwatch, a mechanical Timex his father had given him, and noted the time, 11:32. The tone lasted approximately 4 minutes, then stopped. At 6 that evening, during the scheduled check-in, the tone returned. This time, it lasted 9 minutes. Whitecalf recorded the incident in his logbook and made a note to report the malfunction when they returned to the station. But the tone came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By July 12th, the pattern had become undeniable. The tone occurred twice daily, once in the late morning, once in the early evening. The duration varied, ranging from 3 minutes to nearly 15. The frequency never changed. The rhythm was consistent, a low pulse, irregular but deliberate, almost like breathing. None of them could identify it. Morse code follows strict patterns, dots and dashes, with defined spacing. This was something else. It had structure, but no one in the crew recognized it. Morning Owl, the youngest member of the crew, later told a tribal council member that the tone felt old. She couldn't explain what she meant. She said it reminded her of songs her grandmother used to sing, songs in a language she didn't fully understand. She said it made her think of water, of things moving beneath ice. On July 14th, Tailfeathers hiked down to the Street Mary Ranger Station to report the issue and request replacement radios. The ranger on duty, a seasonal employee named Patrick Delacroix, tested both radios. They functioned normally. No tone, no interference. Delacroix assumed the issue had resolved itself, possibly due to atmospheric conditions or temporary signal bounce from a distant transmitter. He issued replacement radios anyway, as per protocol. Tailfeathers returned to camp. The new radios emitted the same tone at 11:45 that morning. Whitecalf made the decision to document it. He instructed Running Crane to set up a tape recorder, a small cassette device Morning Owl had brought to record bird calls for a personal project. They placed the recorder next to one of the radios and let it run during the evening transmission on July 15th. The tape captured 11 minutes and 37 seconds of the tone. When played back, it was clear and uninterrupted, the rhythm unmistakable. They discussed leaving. The work was nearly finished. The tone wasn't threatening exactly, but it was wrong. Morning Owl wanted to stay. She said her grandmother had told her stories about sounds in the mountains, sounds that meant something was trying to communicate. Whitecalf respected her knowledge. They stayed. The tone continued through July 19th, 11 days total, always twice a day, always the same frequency. On the morning of July 20th, at the usual time, the radios remained silent. The crew waited. Nothing. They checked again that evening. Silence. The tone never returned. When the crew descended from Cutbank Pass on July 21st, Whitecalf submitted a formal incident report to the Blackfeet Forestry Department and the National Park Service. He included the tape recording, his written log, and a joint statement signed by all 4 crew members. The report was forwarded to the regional NPS office in Denver. In September of 1978, the NPS contracted an independent radio engineer named Victor Kowalenko to analyze the recording. Kowalenko operated a small communications consulting firm in Missoula and had previously worked for the Federal Communications Commission. His analysis, completed in October, ran 6 pages. The summary was brief. The tone was not a known emergency signal, not a radio beacon, not interference from commercial or military transmissions. The frequency 154.7 MHz fell within the VHF band used by the Forest Service, but no transmissions from any registered station matched the pattern. Kowalenko noted that the tone's rhythm suggested intentional modulation, but offered no explanation for its source or purpose. He included a recommendation, further analysis, by a signals intelligence specialist. The recommendation was noted but not pursued. The tape was returned to Whitecalf. He kept it in a drawer at his home in Browning for 15 years. In 1993, a documentary filmmaker working on a project about Blackfeet forestry asked to hear it. Whitecalf played it once. The filmmaker asked if he could borrow the tape to have it digitized. Whitecalf declined. He said some things should remain where they are. In 2001, a researcher from Montana State University contacted Morning Owl, who by then worked as a cultural resource specialist for the tribe. The researcher was compiling oral histories related to unexplained phenomena on tribal lands. Morning Owl agreed to an interview. When asked about Cut Bank Pass, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "My grandmother told me that the mountains remember. She said there are places where old things try to speak, and if you're there when they do, you have to listen." We listened. I don't know what it was saying. The researcher asked if she'd ever returned to the pass. She said no. Tailfeathers died in 2009. Running Crane moved to Canada in 2012. Whitecalf retired from forestry work in 2015 and rarely speaks about the incident. When pressed, he says only, "It was a transmission." From where? I don't know. But it wasn't random. The tape still exists. It's held in a private collection, not available for public review. In 2018, an audio engineer who had heard about the incident requested a copy for analysis using modern software. The request was denied. Cut Bank Pass remains remote. The trail is maintained, though infrequently traveled. Forestry crews still work there, though assignments are voluntary. Radios function normally. There have been no further reports of anomalous tones. But in 2016, a backcountry ranger named Jessica Orozco filed a brief note in the Street Mary Station logbook. She had been camped near the pass on July 9th, the same date the original incident began. She wrote, "Radio check at 11:30. Brief interference. Sounded like a pulse. Lasted maybe 30 seconds. Equipment functioning normally afterward." The note was filed. No follow-up was conducted. July 9th, the same date, 38 years later. And if you ask the Blackfeet elders what it means, they would tell you what they've always said. Some things are older than questions. Some weather doesn't obey the seasons, it obeys a calendar. Logan Pass marks the highest point on the Going to the Sun Road, a 50-mile engineering marvel that bisects Glacier National Park along the Continental Divide. At 6,664 feet, the pass serves as both a geographic and meteorological boundary. Weather systems collide here, creating microclimates that shift rapidly and without warning. Snowfall in July is uncommon but not impossible. Rain can turn to sleet in minutes. Fog rolls in like a living thing, erasing the landscape in seconds. The pass has been a crossing point for thousands of years. The Blackfeet called it the backbone of the world. When the road was completed in 1933, it became one of the most visited locations in the park, drawing over 1 million tourists annually by the 1980s. The visitor center at the pass opened in 1966, staffed seasonally from June through September. Rangers there are accustomed to sudden weather changes. They warn tourists daily about hypothermia, lightning, and whiteout conditions. But what happened on August 14, 1983, was different. The day began clear. Morning temperatures reached 68 degrees by 10 o'clock. The National Weather Service forecast for the region predicted continued sunshine with light afternoon winds. No precipitation was expected. No cold fronts were approaching. Satellite imagery showed stable high pressure across northwestern Montana. At 2:17 in the afternoon, snow began falling on the western slope of Logan Pass. Margaret Holloway, a ranger stationed at the visitor center, was conducting a guided nature walk with 11 tourists when the first flakes appeared. She later described them as large and wet, the kind that falls during spring storms, not mid-August. Within 2 minutes, visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Within 5 minutes, snow was accumulating on the ground. The group retreated to the visitor center. Holloway radioed the ranger station at Apgar, 26 miles west, to report the storm. The dispatcher, a seasonal employee named Kevin Brunner, asked her to repeat the message. She did. He confirmed. No precipitation was showing on radar. No storm systems were visible on satellite feeds. He told her to stand by. The snow continued for 23 minutes. During that time, the western slope of Logan Pass, an area measuring roughly 1 square mile, received 4 inches of snow. The temperature dropped to 31 degrees. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour. Tourists, trapped in the visitor center, filmed the storm through windows. Their footage, later reviewed by meteorologists, shows dense snowfall, near-zero visibility, and whiteout conditions consistent with a severe winter blizzard. But on the eastern slope, less than half a mile away, tourists were sunbathing. Daniel Kawamoto, a photographer from Seattle, had been standing at the hidden lake overlook when the storm began. He watched it approach from the west, a wall of white that stopped precisely at the ridgeline. He took photographs. In them, the division is stark. Sunshine and clear skies to the east, dense snow to the west, with the continental divide serving as an absolute boundary. He described the line as sharp enough to cut with a knife. At 2:40, the snow stopped. Not gradually, immediately. Holloway's radio log, obtained through a public records request in 2007, includes the notation 2:40 p.m. precipitation ceased. Sky clearing. Duration 23 minutes. Within an hour, the temperature had returned to 65 degrees. The snow began melting almost immediately. By 4 o'clock, most of it was gone. By 6 o'clock, the ground was dry. Tourists who arrived at the pass later that afternoon found no evidence a storm had occurred. No snow remained, no wet pavement, no lingering cold, but the storm had been documented. Holloway's radio logs, Brunner's dispatch records, 17 separate eyewitness accounts from tourists, 8 rolls of film, 3 amateur videos. All of it confirmed the same facts. Localized snowfall, 23-minute duration, no meteorological explanation. The National Weather Service office in Great Falls received Holloway's formal report on August 15th. Meteorologist Sandra Kowalski reviewed the data and found no atmospheric conditions that could have produced snow. No cold air masses, no moisture sources, no instability in the upper atmosphere. She wrote in her analysis, "The reported event does not align with any known weather model for the region during this time period." Kowalski requested satellite imagery from NOAA for the afternoon of August 14th. The images showed clear skies over Glacier National Park. No cloud formations, no precipitation signatures. She requested radar data from the Missoula station. The radar showed nothing. She contacted Holloway directly. Holloway sent copies of photographs and witness statements. Kowalski examined them and found no evidence of fabrication. The snow was real. The storm had happened. But according to every instrument designed to detect such events, it hadn't. In September of 1983, the National Weather Service filed a report classifying the incident as an unexplained localized precipitation event and recommended further study. The recommendation was noted but not pursued. Kowalski moved to a position in Denver the following year. When contacted by a graduate student in 1998, she said only, "I stand by my analysis. The storm occurred. I don't know why." 10 years later, on August 14th, 1993, it happened again. Ranger Timothy O'Reilly was stationed at Logan Pass that afternoon. At 2:19, snow began falling on the western slope. Duration, 23 minutes. Accumulation, 4 inches. Temperature drop, 37 degrees. The eastern slope remained clear. The boundary was precise. The storm stopped at 2:42. O'Reilly's incident report, filed the same day, noted, "Event mirrors documented storm from August 14, 1983. Same location, same duration, same meteorological impossibility." The National Weather Service was notified. A team from the Great Falls office arrived 2 days later to interview witnesses and review photographic evidence. Their report, submitted in October of 1993, concluded, "No meteorological explanation can be provided for the observed phenomenon." Atmospheric conditions on August 14, 1993 were inconsistent with snow formation at the reported elevation and latitude. The report included a footnote. It referenced the 1983 incident and noted, if pattern continues, next occurrence may be expected on August 14, 2003. On that date, Ranger Jennifer Vasquez was assigned to Logan Pass. She had been briefed on the previous incidents. At 2:15, she positioned herself at the visitor center with a handheld weather station, a digital thermometer, and a video camera. At 2:18, snow began falling. She recorded the entire event. Duration, 23 minutes. Accumulation, 4 inches. Eastern slope, clear. Western slope, blizzard conditions. Vasquez's footage was reviewed by atmospheric scientists at the University of Montana. Dr. Paul Mackenzie, a professor of meteorology, examined the video frame by frame. He noted the precision of the storm's boundary, the consistency of snowfall intensity, and the abrupt cessation at exactly 23 minutes. He wrote in his analysis, "This event defies conventional meteorological understanding. The repeatability suggests a mechanism we do not recognize." Mackenzie attempted to publish his findings. The paper was rejected by 3 separate journals. Reviewers cited insufficient data and lack of reproducible conditions. One reviewer wrote, "The phenomenon, if real, would require a re-evaluation of fundamental atmospheric science. Without a plausible mechanism, publication is not warranted." No further attempts were made to study the storms. The National Park Service quietly briefed rangers assigned to Logan Pass in subsequent years, but issued no public statements. Internal memos obtained through a FOIA request in 2015 instructed staff to document any unusual weather events on August 14, but avoid speculation when speaking with visitors. August 14th, 2013, came and went. No storm. Temperatures reached 72 degrees. Skies remained clear. Rangers waited. Nothing happened. The pattern had broken, or so it seemed. In 2023, on August 14th, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Ranger Carlos Mendoza reported light snow on the western slope of Logan Pass. Duration, 23 minutes. Accumulation, 4 inches. Eastern slope, clear. Mendoza's report was filed, logged, and archived. No investigation was conducted. No meteorologists were contacted. The storm came, lasted exactly 23 minutes, and vanished. As it had before, as it might again. The Going to the Sun Road still crosses Logan Pass. Over 2 million people visit each year. Most are unaware that every 10 years, on a specific date, at a specific time, weather occurs that should not be possible, weather that remembers. And on the eastern slope, the sun keeps shining. Some people come back from the wilderness, changed in ways they can't explain. Grinnell Glacier sits in a high cirque on the eastern edge of Glacier National Park, accessible by a strenuous 6-mile trail that climbs nearly 1,600 feet. The glacier itself has been retreating since measurements began in the 1860s, shrinking from over 500 acres to fewer than 200 by the 1970s. It's a landscape of ice and stone, where meltwater carves channels through ancient rock, and the wind carries a cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The area has always been remote. Even during peak season, fewer than 100 hikers reach the glacier each week. In October, when snow begins to close the high passes, that number drops to nearly 0. Rangers patrol the area monthly during the off-season, checking trail conditions and documenting wildlife activity. These patrols are conducted alone. Radio coverage is unreliable. The nearest ranger station is 11 miles away by trail. Daniel Ostergaard had worked for the National Park Service for 7 years when he disappeared. He was 34 years old, experienced in backcountry navigation, and known for his meticulous record-keeping. He'd been assigned to the many Glacier Ranger District since 1968 and had completed dozens of solo patrols without incident. Colleagues described him as quiet, competent, and unnervingly calm in emergencies. On October 12, 1971, Ostergaard signed out for a routine patrol to Grinnell Glacier. He carried standard equipment, a backpack with 3 days of food, a sleeping bag rated to 10 degrees, a first aid kit, a topographic map, a Silva compass, and a handheld radio. He was expected to return on October 14th. He told the duty ranger, a woman named Carol Pruitt, that he planned to assess early snowpack and check for structural damage to a backcountry privy near the glacier overlook. He didn't return on the 14th. Pruitt radioed his last known position. No response. She waited until the morning of October 15th, then filed a missing person report. A search was organized by midday. 6 rangers and 2 volunteer mountaineers formed a hasty team and hiked to Grinnell Glacier that afternoon. They found his camp intact. His tent was pitched near the privy, exactly where protocol dictated. His sleeping bag was rolled and strapped to his pack. His food bag hung from a bear cable. Nothing appeared disturbed. But Ostergaard was gone. The search expanded. Teams swept the trail, checked side drainages, and examined the glacier's edge for signs of a fall. They found boot prints leading from the camp toward the glacier, but the prints ended abruptly on bare rock. No blood, no torn clothing, no evidence of struggle or accident. The terrain beyond was a maze of talus slopes and ice fields where tracks wouldn't register. By October 16th, the search involved 14 people. Helicopters flew reconnaissance patterns when weather allowed. Divers checked Grinnell Lake, fed by glacier melt, in case Ostergaard had fallen through thin ice. Nothing. On the morning of October 17th, the search coordinator prepared to scale back operations. Then, at 9:43, Ostergaard walked into his own camp. He was alone, on foot, and appeared uninjured. His uniform was clean, his boots showed no unusual wear. He carried his pack, fully loaded. When searchers approached, he greeted them calmly and asked what day it was. He had no memory of the previous 48 hours. Pruitt was the first to interview him. She later described his demeanor as disturbingly normal. He remembered hiking to the glacier on October 12th. He remembered setting up camp. He remembered checking the privy and finding it structurally sound. He remembered eating dinner, freeze-dried beef stew, and writing in his patrol log. The last entry was dated October 12th at 7:15 in the evening. It read, "Weather clear, temp dropping. We'll assess snowpack at first light." After that, nothing. He said he woke up on October 17th, lying on his back near the camp, staring at the sky. He didn't know how he'd gotten there. He didn't feel tired. He wasn't hungry or thirsty. He simply stood up, packed his gear, and waited for someone to arrive. Search coordinator Robert Jankowski asked if he'd been injured or lost. Ostergaard said no. He felt fine. Better than fine, actually. He couldn't explain it. But he felt rested in a way he hadn't in years. Then, Jankowski noticed the compass. It was clipped to Ostergaard's belt, a standard Silva Ranger model identical to the one issued to all NPS field personnel. Jankowski asked to see it. Ostergaard handed it over. The needle pointed south. Jankowski turned in a circle. The needle followed, always pointing south. He checked his own compass. It functioned normally. He asked Ostergaard when he'd last used it. Ostergaard said he'd checked it that morning. He'd assumed it was broken. Jankowski asked why he hadn't mentioned it. Ostergaard shrugged. He said it didn't seem important. Ostergaard was evacuated to the ranger station at Many Glacier, then driven to Kalispell Regional Medical Center for evaluation. Dr. Helen Sokolowski, the attending physician, found no injuries, no signs of hypothermia, no evidence of head trauma. His blood work was normal. His neurological responses were normal. She noted in her report that his pupils were unusually responsive to light, but attributed it to recent time outdoors. She asked if he remembered anything: sounds, smells, visual impressions from the missing 48 hours. He said he remembered cold, not uncomfortable cold, just the presence of it, like a weight. And he remembered blue, a specific shade of blue, deeper than sky, closer to ice. He couldn't describe it more clearly than that. The compass was sent to a geophysics lab at the University of Montana for analysis. Dr. Raymond Coe examined it and found no mechanical defects. The needle moved freely. The housing was intact. But the polarity was reversed. Instead of aligning with Earth's magnetic north, it aligned with magnetic south. Coe had never seen this occur naturally in a functioning compass. He wrote in his report, "The reversal is consistent and stable. No known environmental factor can account for it." Ostergaard returned to work on October 25th. He resumed his duties without comment. Pruitt, who shared a duty schedule with him, noticed changes. He stopped bringing lunch. He didn't eat in the ranger station break room. When she asked if he was feeling all right, he said he wasn't hungry anymore, not in the way he used to be. Other rangers noticed he'd stopped sleeping. His cabin was a small NPS structure near the Many Glacier Hotel, visible from the main road. Multiple witnesses, staff from the hotel, maintenance workers, seasonal rangers, reported seeing him standing at his window every night, motionless, staring toward the mountains. Not for a few minutes, for hours, sometimes the entire night. Ranger Thomas Belinsky shared a wall with Ostergaard's cabin. He told a local journalist in 1989 that he never heard Ostergaard move around at night. No footsteps, no running water, no sounds of someone settling in for sleep, just silence. In the mornings, Ostergaard would appear for his shift on time, clean-shaven, uniform pressed, showing no signs of fatigue. Belinsky asked him once if he was having trouble sleeping. Ostergaard said no. He said he didn't need to sleep anymore. Belinsky thought he was joking. Ostergaard's expression didn't change. He said it wasn't a problem. He said he liked watching the glacier at night. He said it was peaceful. In March of 1972, Ostergaard submitted his resignation. The letter, one paragraph long, gave no reason for leaving. He thanked the Park Service for the opportunity and requested that his final paycheck be sent to a post office box in Whitefish, Montana. His supervisor, District Ranger Floyd Havens, attempted to conduct an exit interview. Ostergaard declined. Havens noted in his personnel file, employee polite but uncommunicative, expressed no dissatisfaction with position. Departure appears voluntary but unexplained. Ostergaard left Glacier National Park on March 18, 1972. He moved to Whitefish and found work as a surveyor for a private land management company. He lived alone in a rented cabin 3 miles outside town. Neighbors rarely saw him. He didn't socialize. He performed his job competently but spoke little. His employer, a man named Victor Desmond, later said, "Ostergaard seemed fine, just quiet." He also noted that Ostergaard never wore a watch and never carried a compass, despite working in remote areas where navigation tools were essential. In June of 1972, Ostergaard's sister, Margaret, visited him in Whitefish. She hadn't seen him since before his disappearance. She later told a family friend that he seemed like a stranger wearing my brother's face. He was polite, she said. He offered her tea, but he didn't ask about her life. He didn't reminisce. He sat across from her and stared, not at her exactly, but through her, as if watching something behind her that she couldn't see. She asked what had happened to him at Grinnell Glacier. He said he didn't remember. She asked if he was happy. He said he didn't know what that word meant anymore. She left after an hour. She never visited again. The compass remained in the University of Montana's geophysics lab until 1998, when the department underwent reorganization. Dr. Coe had retired. The compass was cataloged as anomalous equipment and transferred to a storage facility. In 2004, a graduate student inventoried the collection and tested the compass. It still pointed south. Ostergaard died in 2003. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. He was found in his cabin by a postal carrier delivering a package. He was sitting in a chair near the window, facing north, toward the mountains. The window was open. It was January. The temperature outside was 12 degrees. No one knows how long he'd been sitting there. Fire obeys physics until the moment it decides not to. Bowman Lake sits in the remote northwestern corner of Glacier National Park, a glacial trough stretching 7 miles between steep mountain ridges. The lake is accessible only by a 6-mile dirt road that winds through dense forest, and fewer than 10,000 visitors reach it each year. The surrounding terrain is a patchwork of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and dry meadows fuel-rich landscape that has burned cyclically for millennia. Fire is part of the ecosystem here, as fundamental as water or stone. The summer of 1988 was one of the driest on record across the northern Rockies. By late August, over 200,000 acres were burning in and around Yellowstone National Park, and Montana's wildfire season was escalating rapidly. Glacier National Park had already seen multiple lightning-sparked fires that season, most small and quickly contained, but conditions were severe. Humidity hovered below 20%. Fuel moisture levels were critically low. Fire managers were stretched thin. On September 7th, a lightning strike ignited a small fire in a meadow, approximately 1 mile southeast of Bowman Lake. The fire was designated the Bowman Creek Fire and initially measured less than 2 acres. A Type 2 incident management team was dispatched to assess and contain it. The team consisted of 12 firefighters, including crew boss Leonard Ames, a veteran with 19 years of wildfire experience, and operations specialist Rita Gallegos, who had fought fires across the West since the mid-70s. The fire burned in scattered pockets through dry grass and downed timber. It moved slowly, typical for fires without strong wind. Crews established a fire line on the northern and eastern perimeters, cutting vegetation down to mineral soil and deploying portable pumps to wet the edges. By late afternoon on September 8th, the fire appeared manageable. The forecast predicted stable weather, no wind events, no significant temperature spikes. At 4:12 in the afternoon, the fire made a run to the south. It wasn't unusual. Fires often surge in late afternoon when temperatures peak and humidity drops. What was unusual was how it stopped. Ames and 3 crew members were working the southern flank when they saw the flames accelerate. They backed away, maintaining safe distance, and watched the fire advance across a grassy slope. The flames were 3 to 4 feet high, moving at roughly 15 feet per minute fast, but not dangerously so. The crew expected the fire to continue into a stand of lodgepole pine about 60 yards downslope. It didn't. At a point roughly 40 yards from the tree line, the fire stopped, not slowed, stopped. The line where it ceased was visible and precise. On one side, grass was blackened and still smoldering. On the other side, 6 inches away, the grass was green and untouched. Ames radioed Gallegos, who was stationed at the incident command post near the lake. He described what he was seeing. She drove to his location within 10 minutes. By the time she arrived, the fire had gone out entirely along that southern edge. Smoke drifted upward, but no flames remained. The boundary was still visible, a clean division between burned and unburned ground. Gallegos walked the line. She measured it with a tape measure. The transition from char to green grass occurred over a span of less than 8 inches. She knelt and examined the soil. No change in composition. No rocks, no moisture difference, no obvious reason the fire should have stopped there. She looked for natural fire breaks. There were none. No streams, no roads, no areas of sparse vegetation. The fuel on both sides of the line was identical dry bunchgrass, approximately 12 inches tall, with scattered sagebrush. Wind direction hadn't changed. She checked her handheld weather meter. Wind was still out of the north at 6 miles per hour. Temperature was 71 degrees. Relative humidity was 18%. Ames suggested they test the unburned area. He lit a small section of grass on the green side of the line using a drip torch, a standard tool for controlled burn. The grass ignited, burned for a few seconds, then extinguished itself. He tried again. Same result. The fire would start, flicker, and die, as if something were smothering it. By 5 o'clock, word had spread through the crew. Other firefighters walked the line, taking photographs and collecting samples of burned and unburned vegetation. No one could explain it. Fire behavior analyst Donald Pritchard arrived from the incident command post and spent an hour examining the site. He later wrote in his incident report, "The fire's cessation was abrupt and total. No observable environmental factors account for the halt." The Bowman Creek fire was declared fully contained on September 10th. Final size, 4.3 acres. The incident was classified as a successful suppression effort, with no injuries and minimal resource loss. The anomaly on the southern flank was noted in the official after-action report, but received little attention. Wildfire season was still active. Crews were redeployed to larger fires. The incident was filed and archived, but the people who had been there didn't forget. Gallegos kept a personal journal of her fire assignments. In her entry for September 8th, she wrote, "The fire stopped like it hit glass. I've been doing this for 13 years. I've never seen anything like it." Ames, in a letter to a fellow crew boss dated November of 1988, described the line as unnatural. He wrote, "It wasn't wind, wasn't fuel, wasn't moisture. The fire just quit, like something told it to stop." In January of 1989, the National Park Service conducted a post-season review of all wildfire incidents in Glacier. The Bowman Creek fire was discussed briefly. Several managers asked about the anomaly. Pritchard presented his findings, including photographs and soil samples. The samples showed no chemical differences between burned and unburned areas. No fire retardant had been used in that location. No natural barriers existed. The review panel recommended further analysis by fire ecologists. The recommendation was noted, but not acted upon. The samples were stored in a regional warehouse in Missoula. In 2006, the warehouse was decommissioned and its contents transferred to a federal storage facility in Colorado. The Bowman Creek samples were lost in the transfer. No records indicate their current location. In 2002, a graduate student named Alicia Fernandez was researching historical fire behavior in Glacier National Park for her thesis. She obtained copies of incident reports from the 1980s, including the Bowman Creek fire. Intrigued by the description of the fire's sudden halt, she contacted Gallegos, who had retired and was living in New Mexico. Gallegos agreed to an interview. She described the event in detail and provided copies of her personal journal and photographs. Fernandez asked if she'd ever experienced anything similar in her career. Gallegos said no. She said she'd fought fires for 26 years, and the Bowman Creek fire was the only time she'd seen a fire stop without cause. Fernandez asked if she thought it could happen again. Gallegos paused, then said, "I think it already did. We just didn't notice." Fernandez tried to locate Ames. He had died in 1997. She contacted Pritchard, who confirmed the details of the incident, but declined to speculate on causes. He said fire behavior is complex and not fully understood. He said anomalies occur. Most aren't documented. Most aren't investigated. He said the Bowman Creek fire was unusual, but not unique. When Fernandez asked if similar incidents had been reported elsewhere, Pritchard said he couldn't discuss other cases. When she pressed, he said only, "Some fires stop for reasons we can't measure. That doesn't mean the reasons aren't there." Fernandez's thesis included a chapter on the Bowman Creek fire. Her advisor recommended removing it, citing lack of scientific rigor. Fernandez refused. The thesis was accepted with reservations. It has been cited twice in academic literature, both times in footnotes. The meadow near Bowman Lake is still there. The grass grows back each spring. Hikers pass through it without knowing a fire once stopped there for no reason anyone could prove. The forest has grown denser. The lodgepole pines that the fire never reached are now 60 feet tall, but the line is still visible if you know where to look. The soil on one side is darker, richer. The vegetation patterns differ slightly, and if you walk it carefully, you can still trace the boundary, a place where fire, for reasons no instrument could detect, decided it had gone far enough and turned back. Some cameras don't capture the present, they capture what used to be, or what will be. Street Mary Lake stretches 10 miles along the eastern edge of Glacier National Park, a glacial valley carved during the last ice age. The lake sits at 4,500 feet elevation, bounded by mountains that rise abruptly from the water's edge. The Going to the Sun Road follows the northern shore, offering views that have made the area one of the most photographed locations in Montana. The lake's water is turquoise in summer, fed by glacial melt that carries suspended rock flour. The shoreline is rocky and sparse, dotted with wind-twisted pines and areas of exposed bedrock that geologists use to teach principles of glacial erosion. The area has been studied extensively. Geological surveys date back to the 1890s. Photographic documentation exists from the early 1900s, when the Great Northern Railway promoted the region as a tourist destination. By the late 20th century, Street Mary Lake had been mapped, measured, and cataloged in thousands of academic papers, guidebooks, and Park Service documents. Its features were well known, predictable, stable, until a geology class from Flathead Valley Community College took photographs there in October of 2001. The class was a second-year course in glacial geology, taught by Professor Alan Vickers, a geologist with 12 years of teaching experience. The field study was a standard assignment: document glacial features, collect rock samples, and produce a report analyzing the region's geological history. 14 students participated. They traveled to Street Mary Lake on October 6th, arriving mid-morning under clear skies. Vickers divided the class into 4 groups, each assigned a different section of shoreline. The students were instructed to photograph specific feature striations in bedrock, erratic boulders, terminal moraines, and to take detailed notes on rock composition and weathering patterns. Most students used personal digital cameras, common by 2001, but still relatively new technology. The cameras ranged from basic point-and-shoot models to semi-professional DSLRs. All were functioning normally. One group consisted of 3 students: Marcus Valdez, a 20-year-old geology major; Jennifer Stroud, a 19-year-old pre-med student taking the course as an elective; and Kyle Pemberton, a 23-year-old returning student with prior military experience. They were assigned a section of shoreline near the Wild Goose Island overlook, a popular viewpoint where the road curves close to the water. The group spent 2 hours photographing the area. Valdez focused on bedrock striations, parallel grooves carved by glacial movement. Stroud photographed erratic boulders, large stones deposited by retreating ice. Pemberton took wide landscape shots to provide context for the group's report. They worked methodically, cross-referencing their images with topographic maps and field guides. The weather remained stable. The light was good. Nothing seemed unusual. That evening, the class reconvened at a campground near Street Mary to review the day's work. Students uploaded their images to laptops and began organizing them for their reports. Pemberton was the first to notice something wrong. He had taken 17 photographs of the shoreline from the Wild Goose Island overlook. When he opened the files, 3 of them didn't match what he remembered seeing. The images showed the same location he could identify the island, the mountains, the curve of the road, but the details were different. The vegetation was denser, overgrown in a way that suggested years of unchecked growth. The rocks along the shore appeared more weathered, their surfaces smoothed and darkened. And there was a structure in one of the images, a small boathouse near the water's edge, weathered and partially collapsed. Pemberton showed the images to Valdez and Stroud. They confirmed the location. They had all been standing in that exact spot, but none of them remembered seeing a boathouse. Stroud checked her own images. She had photographed the same area from a slightly different angle. Her images showed the shoreline as they remembered it. No boathouse, no overgrown vegetation, no excessive weathering. Valdez suggested camera malfunction. Pemberton checked the file metadata. The images were timestamped correctly October 6, 2001, between 11:15 and 11:43 in the morning. The camera settings were consistent with the other images. ISO 100, aperture fate, shutter speed 1/125th of a second. The resolution matched. The file format was standard JPEG. There was no indication of corruption or digital manipulation. Vickers reviewed the images when the students approached him. He examined them on Pemberton's laptop, zooming in to check details. The boathouse appeared authentic, weathered wood, sagging roofline, broken windows. The vegetation was consistent with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, species native to the area. The weathering on the rocks was geologically plausible, showing patterns typical of decades of exposure to wind and water. But the boathouse shouldn't exist. Vickers had been teaching field studies at Street Mary Lake for 8 years. He knew the area well. There was no boathouse at that location. He checked his own reference materials, park maps, historical photographs, Forest Service records. No boathouse was documented anywhere near Wild Goose Island. The next morning, Vickers drove back to the overlook with Pemberton, Valdez, and Stroud. They walked to the exact spot where the photographs had been taken, using GPS coordinates from the camera's metadata to confirm the location. The shoreline looked as it had the previous day. No boathouse. No overgrown vegetation. The rocks showed typical weathering for the area moderate, consistent with decades of exposure, but not the advanced erosion visible in Pemberton's photographs. Vickers took his own photographs using a different camera. The images matched the current landscape. He asked Pemberton to take more photographs with the same camera he'd used the day before. Pemberton did. The new images also matched the current landscape. Whatever had happened, it didn't repeat. Back at the campground, Vickers examined the anomalous images more carefully. He noticed other details. The water level in the photographs appeared higher than current levels, approximately 3 to 4 feet higher, based on the position of the shoreline relative to fixed landmark. The road visible in the background appeared narrower, consistent with older construction standards. And in one image, barely visible in the distance, was a small vehicle, a truck or van, parked on the shoulder. The vehicle's design suggested an older model, possibly from the 1970s or 80s. Vickers printed the images and compared them to historical photographs from the park archives. He found a match. A photograph taken in 1974 showed the same boathouse in approximately the same location. The structure had been built by a private landowner before the area was fully incorporated into the national park. It was demolished in 1976 to comply with park regulations. The demolition was documented in Park Service records. Pemberton's photographs showed a boathouse that had been gone for 25 years. Vickers submitted a report to Flathead Valley Community College's academic dean, including the photographs, metadata analysis, and historical documentation. The dean consulted with the college's IT department to determine if digital manipulation was possible. The IT staff examined the files and found no evidence of editing or tampering. The images appeared authentic. The dean recommended Vickers contact the National Park Service. Vickers did, submitting a written report to the Parks Resource Management Office. The report was forwarded to the regional NPS science coordinator, who reviewed it and requested copies of the original image files. Vickers provided them on a CD-ROM. No formal response was issued. When Vickers followed up 6 weeks later, he was told the matter was under review. When he followed up again in January of 2002, He was told the review had been completed, but the findings were not available for public release. When he requested clarification, he received a brief letter stating that the images in question do not raise concerns requiring further investigation. Vickers attempted to publish the incident in a geology journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers cited insufficient evidence of genuine anomaly and potential for equipment error or user manipulation. Vickers responded, providing technical analysis and historical documentation. The paper was rejected again. In 2003, Vickers left Flathead Valley Community College to take a position at a university in Oregon. Before leaving, he gave copies of the photographs to several students, including Pemberton. Pemberton kept them in a folder labeled Street Mary Field Study. He showed them occasionally to friends and colleagues, but most dismissed them as hoaxes or editing errors. In 2012, a photographer named Lena Ostrovsky was researching abandoned structures in national parks for an art project. She contacted former Park Service employees and historians, asking about demolished buildings. One contact mentioned the boathouse near Wild Goose Island. Ostrovsky requested historical records from the park archives and found the 1974 photograph. While researching, she encountered a forum post from Pemberton, dated 2009, describing the anomalous photographs. She contacted him. He provided digital copies. Ostrovsky compared them to the historical image. The match was exact same structure, same angle, same weathering patterns. Ostrovsky asked if she could include the story in her project. Pemberton agreed. The project was exhibited in a small gallery in Missoula in 2013. The exhibition included a printed copy of Pemberton's photograph alongside the historical image from 1974. The text accompanying the exhibit described the incident but offered no explanation. A local journalist attended the exhibit and wrote a brief article. The article was picked up by a regional magazine, which ran a longer feature in 2014. The feature included interviews with Pemberton and Stroud, both of whom confirmed the details of the incident. Valdez declined to be interviewed but provided a written statement corroborating their account. Vickers, by then retired, was contacted by the magazine. He confirmed the incident and provided copies of his original report. He said he still didn't know what had happened. He said digital cameras capture reflected light, nothing more. They don't create images from imagination or memory. If the photographs showed something that wasn't there, then either the cameras malfunctioned in a way no one understands, or they captured something no one was supposed to see. The photographs still exist. Pemberton keeps them on an external hard drive. He has never deleted them. He has shown them to imaging specialists, software engineers, and paranormal researchers. None have provided a satisfactory explanation. The boathouse is gone. It has been gone since 1976. But in 3 photographs taken on October 6, 2001, it stands exactly where it used to be, weathered, collapsing, waiting, as if time itself had looped back just for a moment and let the camera see what was already forgotten. Some trails don't lead forward, they fold back on themselves in ways maps can't show. The Iceberg Lake Trail begins at the Swift Current Motor Inn, in the many Glacier area of Glacier National Park, climbing nearly 1,200 feet over 4.7 miles to a Cirque Lake surrounded by 3,000-foot cliffs. The trail is popular, well-maintained, and clearly marked. It sees over 15,000 hikers each summer. The route passes through subalpine meadows, crosses streams on wooden footbridges, and winds through forests of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The lake itself is a destination cold, deep, and often containing icebergs, even in August. The trail has been used for over a century. Indigenous peoples traveled it long before the park was established in 1910. Early tourists hiked it in the 1920s, guided by employees of the Great Northern Railway. By the 1980s, it was one of the park's most documented routes. featured in every trail guide and visitor map. Thousands of hikers complete it annually without incident. But between 2004 and 2011, 7 people walked the trail and ended up where they started, with no memory of turning back. The first documented case occurred on July 19, 2004. A woman named Rebecca Sinclair, a 36-year-old high school teacher from Boise, set out alone from the Swift Current trailhead at 9:30 in the morning. She signed the trail register, noting her intended destination as Iceberg Lake. She carried a day pack with water, snacks, and a trail map. She wore a wristwatch, a Timex digital model, and had fully charged her cell phone, though she knew there would be no service. Sinclair described herself as an experienced hiker. She had completed dozens of trails in Idaho and Montana. She knew how to navigate, how to pace herself, and how to recognize landmarks. She expected the hike to take approximately 3 hours to the lake, with a similar return time. She remembered starting up the trail. She remembered crossing the first footbridge over Swift Current Creek. She remembered entering a section of dense forest where the trail switchbacked up a steep slope. Then, without transition, she was standing at the trailhead again, facing the parking lot. She checked her watch. It read 12:05. 2 hours and 35 minutes had passed. She felt as if she'd been hiking for maybe 30 minutes. She wasn't tired. She wasn't out of breath. Her water bottle was still full. She had no memory of turning around, no memory of descending the trail, no recollection of passing other hikers. She checked the trail register. Her signature was still there, the only entry since 8:45. No one else had signed in or out. She stood at the trailhead for several minutes, trying to reconstruct what had happened. She couldn't. She returned to her car and drove back to her hotel in West Glacier. That evening, she mentioned the experience to the hotel clerk, who suggested fatigue or altitude sickness. Sinclair didn't think either explanation fit. She felt fine, but she didn't pursue it further. The second case occurred on August 3, 2006. Darren Kellogg, a 28-year-old software engineer from Portland, hiked the Iceberg Lake Trail with his girlfriend, Melissa Ortega. They started at 10:15 in the morning. Both were carrying GPS units, Garmin handheld models commonly used for geocaching. Kellogg had programmed the trailhead coordinates and the lake coordinates into his device. He checked it periodically as they hiked, watching their progress. At approximately 11 o'clock, after what felt like 30 to 40 minutes of hiking, they found themselves back at the trailhead. Kellogg checked his GPS. It showed they had traveled 0.2 miles. His watch read 11:18. Ortega's watch read 11:19. They had been hiking for over an hour, but the GPS insisted they had barely left the parking area. Ortega suggested they try again. They set out a second time, walking more deliberately, paying closer attention to landmarks. This time, they made it to the lake without incident. The hike took 3 hours and 10 minutes. When they returned to the trailhead at the end of the day, Kellogg reviewed the GPS track log. It showed 2 separate tracks. The first, a short fragment that looped back to the start, and the second, a complete route to the lake and back. He saved both tracks and later posted about the experience on a hiking forum. The post received a few replies, most suggesting equipment error. One reply, from a user named Glacier Local, said only, "Iceberg does that sometimes." The third case occurred on September 9, 2007. A retired couple, Harold and Diane Mustafa, started the trail at 8:45 in the morning. They were experienced hikers in their early 60s, both in good health. They carried a printed trail map and a compass. At what they estimated to be around 9:30, they found themselves back at the trailhead. Diane's watch read 10:12. Harold's watch read 10:14. Neither could explain how they'd returned. They had no memory of descending. Harold insisted they had been walking uphill the entire time. They reported the incident to a ranger at the Many Glacier Ranger Station. The ranger, A seasonal employee named Patrick Sawyer listened and made a note in his daily log. He suggested disorientation or a mild medical event. The Mustafas declined medical evaluation. They left the park that afternoon and did not return. The fourth through seventh cases followed similar patterns. In 2008, a solo hiker named Yuki Tanaka. In 2009, two college students, Erica Lundgren and Pablo Reyes, hiking separately but experiencing the same phenomenon on the same day. In 2010, a wildlife photographer named Marcus Beaulieu. In 2011, a trail runner named Vanessa Cole. All reported the same sequence: beginning the hike, walking for what felt like 30 to 40 minutes, then finding themselves back at the trailhead with no memory of turning around. All reported time discrepancies. Their watches showed more time had passed than they remembered. Some reported feeling briefly disoriented. None reported feeling ill or impaired. None could explain what had happened. In 2012, a seasonal ranger named Jordan Halifax noticed a pattern while reviewing incident logs from previous years. He compiled a list of the reports and brought it to the attention of the district ranger, a woman named Valerie Crane. Crane reviewed the reports and contacted the individuals involved, asking them to provide written statements. 5 of the 7 responded. Their accounts were consistent. Crane requested a trail assessment. In August of 2012, a team of 3 rangers hiked the Iceberg Lake Trail, documenting conditions, checking signage, and noting any areas where hikers might become confused or disoriented. They found nothing unusual. The trail was well marked, clearly defined, and showed no signs of unofficial side trails or confusing junctions. The team completed the hike without incident. Crane filed a report with the park's Resource Management Office, summarizing the incidents and the trail assessment. She noted that no environmental or infrastructural factors were identified that would explain the reported experiences. She recommended continued monitoring, but no further action. The report was filed and archived. No additional incidents were reported after 2011. Halifax, the ranger who had identified the pattern, left the Park Service in 2014. When contacted by a journalist in 2018, he confirmed the incidents but said he had no explanation. He said the hikers seemed credible. He said their accounts were too similar to dismiss as coincidence. Sinclair, the first reported case, was contacted again in 2019. She still remembered the experience clearly. She said she had returned to Glacier twice since 2004, but had not attempted the Iceberg Lake Trail again. When asked why, she said, "I don't think I could trust it. I don't think I'd know if I was moving forward or just walking in place." Kellogg, the hiker with the GPS, analyzed his track logs again in 2020. He used modern mapping software to overlay the tracks onto satellite imagery. The first track, the loop that brought him back to the trailhead, showed a path that matched the trail for approximately half a mile, then deviated into an area of dense forest where no trail existed. The GPS coordinates placed him in locations where the terrain was impassable: steep slopes, thick undergrowth, areas no hiker could traverse. Yet the track showed continuous movement, as if he had been walking normally the entire time. He posted the analysis on the same hiking forum. The original thread from 2006 was still active. Glacier Local, the user who had commented years earlier, replied again, "You weren't lost. The trail was. No one knows who Glacier Local is. The account has been inactive since 2021. The Iceberg Lake Trail is still open. It still appears on every park map. Thousands of people hike it every summer. Most reach the lake, take photographs, and return without incident." Rangers no longer mention the reports from 2004 through 2011. The incidents are not included in trail briefings or safety materials, but the reports are still there, filed in the park's archives. 7 people, 7 identical experiences, 7 watches that gained time instead of losing it, and a trail that, for reasons no one can document, occasionally leads hikers back to where they started, without their knowledge, without their consent, as if the trail itself had decided they weren't meant to reach the lake. Not that day. Not yet. Some patterns are too deliberate to be natural and too old to be explained. Sperry Glacier sits at 7,200 feet on the western slope of the Continental Divide, one of the most remote glacial formations in Glacier National Park. The glacier has been retreating since the mid-1800s, losing over 70% of its mass by the late 20th century. The surrounding terrain is severe vertical rock faces, unstable talus slopes, and exposed ridges where weather can turn lethal in minutes. Access requires technical climbing skills and wilderness permits. Fewer than 200 people visit the glacier annually, most of them mountaineers or researchers. The area has little recorded human history. The Kootenai and Salish peoples traveled through the region, but evidence of permanent settlement is absent. Early trappers and prospectors avoided the high country. The first documented ascent to Sperry Glacier occurred in 1895, led by a geological survey team mapping the park's glacial features. By 1979, the glacier had been studied extensively, but the cliffs and ridges above it remained largely unexplored. On August 23, 1979, two park rangers conducted a backcountry patrol to assess trail conditions and monitor wildlife activity near the glacier. The rangers were Lawrence Finch, a 12-year veteran with mountaineering experience, and Sandra Miyamoto, a seasonal employee, completing her second summer with the Park Service. They carried standard climbing gear, emergency supplies, and a 35mm camera for documenting their observations. The patrol was routine until they climbed above the glacier's eastern margin, following a ridgeline that offered access to an unmapped plateau. The terrain was difficult, loose rock, narrow ledges, exposure on both sides. They reached the plateau at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. The area was barren, windswept, covered in lichen-stained boulders and patches of alpine sedge. And in the center of the plateau, they found the spiral. It measured roughly 18 feet in diameter, composed of 47 stones arranged in a clockwise pattern that tightened toward the center. The stones were granite, angular, and unweathered, ranging in size from roughly 2 feet to nearly 4 feet across. Finch estimated the smallest weighed at least 40 pounds. The largest may have weighed over 100. The arrangement was precise. The spacing between stones was uniform. The spiral's geometry was nearly perfect, tightening at a consistent rate from the outer edge to the center, where a single flat stone lay embedded in the ground. Miyamoto photographed it from multiple angles, while Finch examined the stones individually. There were no tool marks, no evidence of shaping or carving. The stones appeared to have been selected for size and placed deliberately, but their surfaces were untouched. Finch checked for inscriptions or symbols. He found none. The only markings were patches of orange and gray lichen, colonies that grow slowly in alpine environments, sometimes less than a millimeter per year. Miyamoto suggested the arrangement might be recent, created by climbers or researchers. Finch disagreed. He pointed to the lichen coverage. The colonies on the stones were extensive, covering 30 to 50% of each surface. He also noted that the ground beneath and around the stones showed no disturbance, no scrape marks, no displaced soil, no indication the stones had been moved recently. They spent an hour documenting the site. Finch used a compass to confirm the spiral's orientation. It was aligned almost perfectly with magnetic north. Miyamoto sketched the pattern in her field notebook and noted the location using a topographic map and altimeter. The plateau was not marked on the map. No trails led to it. Reaching it required climbing skills and route-finding ability. When they descended that evening, Finch reported the discovery to the chief ranger at the West Glacier headquarters. He submitted his photographs and Miyamoto's field notes. The chief ranger, a man named Bernard Kowalski, reviewed the materials, and forwarded them to the park's cultural resources specialist, Dr. Ellen Travers, an archaeologist with a background in indigenous history. Travers examined the photographs and requested permission to visit the site. Permission was granted. On September 5, 1979, Travers, Finch, and a third ranger, Gregory Alvarez, climbed to the plateau. Travers brought tools for collecting lichen samples, measuring instruments, and a Polaroid camera for additional documentation. She confirmed Finch's observations. The stones were arranged deliberately. The lichen coverage was extensive. She collected samples from 3 separate stones and labeled them for laboratory analysis. She also noted that the lichen colonies appeared uniform in age, suggesting the stones had been in place for a considerable time, decades at minimum, possibly much longer. Travers measured the stones and documented their positions relative to each other. She searched the surrounding area for additional artifacts, pottery shards, tool fragments, fire rings, and found nothing. The spiral stood alone, isolated, with no accompanying features that might indicate its purpose or origin. In her preliminary report, dated September 12, 1979, Travers wrote, "The arrangement is consistent with intentional human activity, but predates known historical occupation of the region. Further analysis required." The lichen samples were sent to a laboratory at the University of Montana for carbon dating. The process took 3 months. The results, returned in December of 1979, indicated the lichen colonies were approximately 300 to 350 years old. The margin of error was plus or minus 50 years, but the age range was consistent across all 3 samples. Travers consulted historical records and ethnographic studies. No indigenous accounts described stone arrangements in the Sperry Glacier area. No European explorers or trappers had documented traveling through the region before the late 1800s. The arrangement appeared to predate any known human presence in the area by over a century. Travers recommended a follow-up expedition to conduct more extensive archaeological survey work. The recommendation was approved. A second trip was scheduled for July of 1980, during the brief window when weather conditions allowed safe access to the plateau. On July 9, 1980, Travers, Finch, and 2 additional researchers, Dr. Ramon Silva, a geologist, and Margaret Delacroix, a graduate student in archaeology, returned to the site. They carried more sophisticated equipment, a theodolite for precise measurements, soil core sampling tools, and a portable generator to power a ground-penetrating radar unit. The plateau was as they had left it. The spiral was intact. The stones had not moved. Travers began a detailed survey, while Silva examined the geology of the area, looking for natural explanations, glacial deposition, rock slides, freeze-thaw cycles that might account for the pattern. He found none. The stones were granite, consistent with the surrounding bedrock, but their placement was inconsistent with any known geological process. Delacroix operated the ground-penetrating radar, scanning the area beneath and around the spiral. The radar detected no subsurface features, no burial sites, no hidden chambers, no voids that might suggest the arrangement marked something below ground. The spiral appeared to be exactly what it looked like. Stones placed on the surface. Nothing more. They worked for 3 days. On the afternoon of July 11th, as they prepared to descend, Travers took a final set of photographs. She wanted a comprehensive visual record before the site was formally documented in academic literature. When the team returned to the park headquarters on July 12th, Travers began writing a formal report. She planned to submit it to the Montana Archaeological Society and request additional funding for a multi-year study. The report was nearly complete when she received a radio call from Finch on July 18th. He had returned to the plateau to retrieve a piece of equipment left behind during the expedition. The spiral was gone. Not damaged, not scattered, gone. The stones were no longer there. The ground where they had been was smooth, covered in the same lichen and sedge that surrounded the area. Finch searched the plateau. He found no stones matching the size and shape of those in the spiral. He checked for signs of human activity, boot prints, tool marks, disturbance in the vegetation. He found nothing. He radioed Travers. She didn't believe him. She thought he had gone to the wrong location. Finch insisted. He knew the site. He had been there 4 times. He provided GPS coordinates, an experimental technology just becoming available to park rangers in 1980. The coordinates matched. Travers returned to the plateau on July 21st with Silva and Kowalski. Finch was correct. The spiral was gone. The stones were gone. The ground showed no evidence they had ever been there. Travers examined the area where the central stone had been embedded. The soil was undisturbed, covered in lichen growth that appeared decades old. Silva suggested landslide or rockfall, despite the lack of evidence. Travers rejected the theory. She said the stones were too large to be moved by natural processes without leaving traces. Kowalski suggested theft, though he acknowledged the logistical impossibility. Removing 47 heavy stones from a remote plateau, accessible only by technical climbing, would require significant effort, equipment, and time. No helicopters had been reported in the area. No climbing permits had been issued. Travers filed a formal incident report with the National Park Service. The report was forwarded to the regional office in Denver. No investigation was initiated. In August of 1980, Travers received a brief letter from the NPS regional director stating that, without physical evidence, the matter cannot be pursued further. Travers attempted to publish her findings. She submitted a paper to the Journal of Archaeological Science, including photographs, lichen dating results, and witness statements. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that without the physical site, verification was impossible. One reviewer wrote, "The photographs are compelling, but the disappearance of the site raises questions about the integrity of the observations." Travers left the Park Service in 1982. Silva continued his geological work but never returned to Sperry Glacier. Finch remained a ranger until his retirement in 1995. When asked about the spiral in a later interview, he said only, "I saw it. I photographed it. Then it wasn't there. I don't have an explanation." The photographs still exist, held in the Glacier National Park archives. They show the spiral clearly, 47 stones, arranged in perfect geometric order, on a plateau that no longer contains them. And the lichen, 300 years old, growing on stones that disappeared in less than a week, as if something had decided the spiral had been seen enough and taken it back. Some places don't just reflect sound, they respond to it. Two Medicine Lake sits in the southeastern corner of Glacier National Park, a glacial valley carved between steep mountain walls that rise nearly 5,000 feet from the water's edge. The lake stretches 2 miles, fed by snowmelt and ringed by subalpine forest. It's quieter than other areas of the park, receiving fewer than 30,000 visitors annually. The Blackfeet Nation considers the area sacred, a place where traditional ceremonies were conducted long before the land became a national park in 1910. The lake's acoustics have always been notable. Early visitors in the 1920s wrote about the clarity of sound across the water, how voices carried with unusual precision, how a shout from one shore could be heard distinctly on the other. Guides would demonstrate the effect for tourists, calling out across the lake and waiting for the echo to return. The phenomenon was considered a natural curiosity, a product of the valley's shape and the density of the surrounding rock. But in the summer of 1993, a visitor reported something different. Thomas Brennan, a 51-year-old architect from Minneapolis, was standing at the boat launch on the lake's southern shore on the morning of July 14th. He was alone, waiting for his family to return from a restroom facility. The water was calm. The air was still. He called out to test the echo, a habit from his childhood visits to similar lakes. He said, clearly and deliberately, "Hello, to Medicine." The echo came back, but it wasn't quite right. Brennan described it in a letter to the Park Service as almost my voice, but not quite. The inflection was different, he said, as if someone else were repeating his words with a slightly different emphasis. He tried again, calling out, "Can you hear me?" The echo returned, "Can you hear me?" But the stress was on you instead of here, as if the question were more pointed, more personal. Brennan stopped calling out. He said he felt unsettled, though he couldn't explain why. When his family returned, he didn't mention it. The incident might have been dismissed as a trick of perception, a misheard echo, if Brennan had been the only one. But he wasn't. In August of 1994, a park ranger named Lucia Dominguez was conducting a morning patrol along the lakeshore. She was radioing her position to the district office when she heard her own voice echo back from across the water. She had said, "Morning check-in, 2 Medicine South Shore, all clear." The echo repeated, "Morning check-in, 2 Medicine South Shore, all clear." But then, after a brief pause, it added, "Not yet." Dominguez stopped walking. She keyed her radio and asked the dispatcher if they had transmitted anything. The dispatcher said no. Dominguez asked if anyone else was on the channel. The dispatcher confirmed the channel was clear. Dominguez stood at the shore for several minutes, listening. She heard nothing more. She filed a brief note in her daily log, but did not elaborate. In June of 1995, a family visiting from Oregon reported a similar experience. The father, William Kowalski, had called out to his children who were skipping stones near the water's edge. He shouted, "Be careful near the water." The echo came back with the words in a different order, "Near the water. Be careful." Kowalski's wife, Sandra, heard it too. She described it later as sounding like someone was correcting him. Their children didn't notice. The family left the lake shortly afterward. Sandra mentioned the incident to a ranger at the visitor center. The ranger made no official note of it. By 1996, enough informal reports had accumulated that the park's resource management office took notice. The reports weren't frequent, perhaps 6 or 7 over 3 years, but they were consistent. Visitors and staff described echoes that didn't match what they had said, echoes that included words they hadn't spoken, or echoes that emphasized different syllables in ways that changed the meaning of their statements. In September of 1996, the Park Service contracted 2 acoustic engineers from the University of Montana to assess the lake's sound properties. Dr. Raymond Wynn, a specialist in environmental acoustics, and his colleague, Dr. Patricia O'Malley, spent 4 days at 2 Medicine conducting tests. They used calibrated sound sources, speakers that emitted tones at specific frequencies and volumes. They recorded echoes from multiple positions around the lake. They measured reverberation times, sound decay rates, and frequency response. The lake's acoustics were unusual, but not unprecedented. The steep walls created strong reflections. The water's surface acted as an efficient sound mirror. Echoes were clear and distinct. But there were anomalies. Nguyen noted in his preliminary report that certain frequencies behaved inconsistently. Low-frequency sounds below 200 Hz sometimes returned with slight phase shifts, as if the echo were delayed by fractions of a second longer than physics predicted. Higher frequencies occasionally returned, with amplitude changes that didn't correspond to distance or environmental conditions. More troubling were the voice tests. O'Malley recorded herself speaking standardized phrases, simple sentences, used in acoustic research to test intelligibility. When she played back the recordings, several contained artifacts, faint, almost imperceptible additions to the echoes. In one recording, she had said, "The lake is calm today." The echo repeated, "The lake is calm today." But in the final second of the recording, beneath the fading reverberation, was a whisper, "Always." O'Malley replayed the recording multiple times. The whisper was present in every playback. She checked her equipment. It was functioning correctly. She recorded the same phrase again from the same location. The whisper did not repeat. Nguyen and O'Malley completed their assessment and submitted a report in November of 1996. The report confirmed abnormal acoustic properties but offered no definitive explanation. Nguyen wrote, "The observed phenomena exceed the expected behavior of sound in this environment. Further study, with more sensitive equipment, is recommended." The Park Service reviewed the report and declined to pursue further testing. In a memo dated January of 1997, the regional director noted that the anomalies, while unusual, do not present a safety concern and are unlikely to affect visitor experience significantly. The memo also included a directive. Staff were instructed not to discuss the acoustic anomalies with visitors unless directly asked. If asked, they were to describe the echoes as natural features of the lake's geography and avoid speculation. Dominguez, the ranger who had heard her own voice echo with an added phrase, left the Park Service in 1998. In a private conversation with a colleague years later, she said the incident at Two Medicine had unsettled her more than she'd admitted at the time. She said it wasn't just what the echo said, it was the timing. She said the words, "not yet," came after a pause, as if something were considering its response. In 2003, a Blackfeet elder named Franklin White Buffalo was interviewed by a graduate student researching indigenous connections to Glacier National Park. The student asked about Two Medicine Lake. White Buffalo said, "The Blackfeet have always known the lake listens." He said there are certain places where sound doesn't just travel, it interacts. He said his grandfather had told him never to speak carelessly near the water, because words spoken there might be remembered. When the student asked what he meant by remembered, White Buffalo declined to elaborate. He said only, "The lake has been here longer than we have. It knows things we've forgotten." In 2009, a backpacker named Jamal Rashid reported an experience he later posted on a wilderness forum. He had been camping near Two Medicine and woke before dawn to watch the sunrise. Standing at the shore, he spoke aloud a habit when hiking alone. He said, "This is beautiful." The echo came back. This was beautiful. He checked his post later and clarified. He was certain of the tense. He had said is. The echo said was. In 2015, the Park Service updated its acoustic monitoring protocols for several locations in Glacier, including Two Medicine Lake. The updates included instructions for documenting unusual sound phenomena. Rangers were provided with digital recording devices and trained to note any reports of anomalous echoes. Between 2015 and 2023, reports were filed. All described echoes that didn't match the original statements. None were investigated further. The most recent documented case occurred in August of 2022. A visitor named Chloe Baxter was photographing the lake at sunset. She called out to her partner, who was farther down the shore. "I'm almost done here." The echo repeated, "I'm almost done." She didn't notice the omission at first, but her partner did. He walked back to her and asked why she'd said that. She said she hadn't. She'd said, "I'm almost done here." He insisted he'd heard her say, "I'm almost done" twice, once in her normal voice and once as an echo. They tested it. They called out several phrases. Most echoed normally, but one, "we should leave soon," came back as, "we should leave." They left immediately. Two Medicine Lake is still open. Visitors still call out across the water to hear their voices return. Most hear exactly what they expect, a faithful reproduction of sound, delayed by distance and reflected by stone. But some hear something else, a voice that sounds like theirs but isn't. Words that are almost right but slightly wrong. And sometimes, very rarely, words they haven't spoken yet. As if the lake isn't just listening, as if it's answering. Some mechanisms keep running long after they should have stopped. Polebridge sits at the remote northwestern entrance to Glacier National Park, accessible only by 30 miles of unpaved road that winds through dense forest and crosses the North Fork of the Flathead River. The area is isolated, even by Montana standards. No cell service, no grid electricity. The nearest town, Columbia Falls, is over an hour's drive on rutted gravel. The ranger station was built in 1937 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, a simple log structure designed to house seasonal staff during fire season. The station operated continuously until 1963, when budget cuts reduced staffing in remote districts. The building was mothballed that fall, its furniture removed, its windows boarded, its door chained shut. Over the following decades, it deteriorated slowly. The roof leaked, the floorboards warped. Wildlife made nests in the eaves. By the 1980s, the structure was considered unsafe and slated for demolition. But preservationists intervened, arguing for its historical value. The building was stabilized in 1992, but never reopened for official use. Hikers and hunters occasionally sheltered there during storms. The door was no longer chained. Park policy allowed emergency use of abandoned structures. Inside, the station retained some of its original features: a potbelly stove, a wooden desk, a wall-mounted filing cabinet, and on the wall above the desk, a clock. It was a standard institutional timepiece from the 1940s, round face, black numerals, metal frame, mechanical, wind-up, the kind that required manual winding every 7 days to keep running. It had hung in that spot since the station opened. And according to park records, it hadn't been wound since the station closed in October of 1963. The first documented report of the clock-keeping time came in July of 1997. A backpacker named Aaron Fitzgerald stopped at the station during a thunderstorm. He was alone, soaked, and looking for shelter. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dim, dusty, smelling of mildew and old wood. He noticed the clock immediately. It read 3:47. He checked his wristwatch, a Casio digital model. 3:49. Close enough, he thought, to be a coincidence. Mechanical clocks sometimes stop at random times, creating the illusion they're still working when someone happens to check them. He didn't think much of it, but the next morning, when he left the station, he glanced at the clock again. It read 7:12. His watch read 7:14. The clock had advanced. He stood there, staring at it, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. He walked over and examined it closely. The clock was old, its face yellowed, its hands tarnished. He pressed his ear against it. He heard nothing, no ticking, no mechanical sound, but the second hand was moving smoothly, steadily, advancing 1 second at a time. He didn't report the incident. He assumed there was a logical explanation. Maybe the Park Service maintained the clock. Maybe someone wound it regularly. He left Polbridge and didn't think about it again until years later, when he read a forum post describing the same phenomenon. In August of 2001, a group of 3 hikers, Daniel Vargas, Megan O'Sullivan, and Kenji Yamamoto, used the station as a rest stop during a multi-day trek. Vargas noticed the clock and commented on it. He said it was unusual for an abandoned building to have a working clock. O'Sullivan checked her watch. The clock was accurate to within a minute. Yamamoto suggested someone must be maintaining it. Vargas disagreed. He said the place looked untouched. Everything was covered in dust except the clock face, which was clean. They stayed at the station for 20 minutes, eating lunch and refilling water bottles from a nearby creek. Before leaving, Yamamoto took a photograph of the clock. The image showed the time as 2:36. His camera's timestamp, embedded in the digital file, recorded the photo at 2:37. When Yamamoto posted the image on a hiking blog in 2002, several commenters claimed they had also seen the clock keeping accurate time. One commenter, a username Trail Ghost, wrote, "I've been to Polbridge 6 times since 1998. That clock is always right. Always." In 2004, a park maintenance worker named Leonard Kozinski was assigned to inspect the station as part of a broader assessment of abandoned structures. Kosinski had worked for the Park Service for 11 years and was familiar with the area. He arrived at Polbridge on the afternoon of September 9th, carrying tools, a camera, and a checklist of structural issues to document. He noticed the clock immediately. It read 4:03. He checked his cell phone, no service. But the time display still functioned. 4:05. He made a note. Wall clock appears functional. Unknown maintenance history. Kosinski returned to the station the next morning to complete his inspection. The clock read 9:21. His phone read 9:22. He examined the clock more closely. He opened the back panel, expecting to find a battery compartment or evidence of recent winding. He found neither. The mechanism was entirely mechanical, spring-driven, gear-operated, unchanged since its manufacture in the 1940s. The mainspring was loose, unwound. The clock should not have been running. Kosinski filed a report with the district ranger, a man named Victor Delgado. The report included photographs of the clock's mechanism and a recommendation to remove it for further examination. Delgado approved the removal. On September 23, 2004, Kosinski returned to the station with a replacement clock, a modern battery-powered unit purchased from a hardware store in Columbia Falls. He removed the old clock, packed it carefully, and mounted the new one in its place. The old clock was brought to the park's maintenance facility in West Glacier. Kosinski and another technician, a woman named Sandra Kowalski, examined it in a workshop. The mechanism was intact but non-functional. The mainspring had no tension. When they attempted to wind it, the spring engaged but offered no resistance. It was fully relaxed, incapable of storing energy. They set the clock to the correct time and watched it. The second hand did not move. Kowalski suggested the clock had been running on residual spring tension, a phenomenon where tightly wound springs can retain enough energy to function briefly even after winding ceases. Kosinski disagreed. He said the spring was completely unwound. Residual tension wouldn't last 41 years. They left the clock on a shelf in the workshop, intending to return to it later. Neither did. The clock sat untouched for 3 months. In January of 2005, a ranger named Thomas O'Reilly visited the Polbridge station to check on the new clock. He found it stopped. The battery was fresh. He'd installed it himself during a separate maintenance visit in November, but the clock no longer functioned. The hands were frozen at 11:46. He replaced the battery. The clock started, ran for 10 seconds, and stopped again. O'Reilly radioed Kosinski and described the issue. Kosinski suggested a defective clock and authorized a replacement. O'Reilly purchased a second battery-powered clock in February of 2005 and installed it at the station. Within a week, it too had stopped. Kosinski decided to reinstall the original clock. He retrieved it from the workshop in March of 2005. The clock had not been touched since September. When he picked it up, he noticed the second hand was moving. He checked the time. It was correct, accurate to within 90 seconds. He examined the mechanism again. The mainspring was still unwound. He brought the clock back to Polbridge and remounted it on the wall above the desk. It continued to keep time. Over the following months, rangers and visitors reported the clock's accuracy consistently. In 2006, Delgado requested an explanation from Kosinski. Kosinski responded with a memo stating, "No mechanical explanation can account for the clock's operation. Recommend further study by horological specialist." No specialist was consulted. The clock remained on the wall. In 2011, a journalist named Isabel Hernandez visited Polbridge while researching a feature on remote ranger stations. She spoke with several hikers who mentioned the clock. Intrigued, she visited the station herself and found the clock keeping accurate time. She photographed it and included a brief mention in her article, published in a regional magazine. The article described the clock as a minor mystery, possibly maintained by locals or park staff, that adds charm to an otherwise forgotten outpost. Hernandez later attempted to contact Kosinski for follow-up. She learned he had retired in 2009. She reached him by phone. Kosinski told her the clock had no rational explanation. He said he'd examined it thoroughly and found no power source, no hidden mechanism, no explanation for its continued operation. When Hernandez asked if he believed in supernatural explanations, Kosinski said he didn't. He said he believed in things he couldn't explain. In 2018, the Park Service conducted another structural assessment of the Polbridge station. The inspector, a contractor named Malcolm Ritter, noted the clock in his report. He wrote, "Wall clock operational, time accurate, origin and maintenance unknown. The clock is still there. Hikers still check it. It's still accurate, usually within 1 or 2 minutes of correct time. Motion-activated cameras have been installed in the station twice, in 2015 and 2020, as part of wildlife monitoring efforts. The cameras captured hundreds of hours of footage. No one entered the station during those periods. The clock continued to run. In 2022, a horologist named Dr. Evelyn Park reviewed photographs of the clock's mechanism at the request of a true crime podcast investigating unexplained phenomena. Dr. Park stated that the clock's design required winding every 7 days and that without winding, it could not function for more than 10 days under any circumstances. She noted that even if the spring had been wound in 1963, it would have stopped completely by early 1964. The clock has been running for over 60 years. No one winds it. No one maintains it. And every time someone checks, the time is right. As if something, somewhere, is keeping track and refuses to let it stop. Mountains are supposed to be permanent, until one proves otherwise. Mount Cleveland stands at the northern edge of Glacier National Park, straddling the U.S.-Canada border. At what was long recorded as 10,499 feet, it's the highest peak in the park, a pyramidal summit of sedimentary rock shaped by millions of years of tectonic pressure and glacial erosion. The mountain is remote, technical, and dangerous. Fewer than 50 climbers attempt it each year. Weather systems form without warning. Rockfall is constant. The summit ridge is knife-edged, exposed on all sides. The first recorded ascent occurred in 1924. The first accurate elevation measurement came in 1901, when a U.S. Geological Survey team used triangulation to establish the summit at 10,499 feet above sea level. That figure was verified by subsequent surveys in 1936, 1952, and 1978. Topographic maps published across 8 decades listed the same elevation. It became a fixed point of reference, a benchmark used to calibrate instruments and train surveyors. Until 2009, when the mountain was 33 feet shorter. The discrepancy was discovered during a routine GPS survey conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey as part of a nationwide effort to update elevation data using satellite-based measurements. The survey team, led by geologist Dr. Marcus Delacroix, used differential GPS equipment accurate to within 2 centimeters. The technology had replaced older triangulation methods and was considered definitive. Delacroix's team reached the summit on August 7, 2009. After a 3-day climb, conditions were clear. Visibility extended for miles. They set up a GPS receiver on the highest exposed rock and allowed it to record data for 45 minutes, standard procedure for high-precision measurements. When they processed the data that evening at base camp, the elevation read 10,466 feet. Delacroix assumed equipment error. GPS receivers occasionally malfunction at high altitude due to atmospheric interference or satellite geometry. He checked the data logs. The receiver had locked onto 9 satellites, more than sufficient for accuracy. The position dilution of precision was excellent. The measurement appeared valid. 2 days later, on August 9th, Delacroix returned to the summit with a second GPS unit. The reading was identical. 10,466 feet. He took a third measurement the following morning. Same result. The summit of Mount Cleveland was 33 feet lower than every recorded measurement from the previous century. Delacroix descended and filed a preliminary report with the USGS regional office in Denver. He noted the discrepancy and requested verification. In September of 2009, a second survey team led by Dr. Yolanda Pereira, a geodesist with 15 years of experience, climbed Mount Cleveland and conducted independent measurements using different equipment. Pereira's results confirmed Delacroix's findings. 10,466 feet. The USGS convened a review panel to assess the data. The panel included geologists, surveyors, and GPS specialists. They examined instrument calibrations, satellite ephemeris data, atmospheric models, and geoid calculations. They found no errors. The measurements were accurate. Mount Cleveland had lost 33 feet of elevation. The panel then searched for explanations. Mountains can lose elevation through several mechanisms: erosion, landslides, volcanic collapse, seismic subsidence. Mount Cleveland is not volcanic. Seismic records for the region showed no significant earthquakes between 1978, the last verified measurement, and 2009. Satellite imagery from multiple dates showed no evidence of landslides or rockfall large enough to account for 33 feet of missing summit. Dr. Harold Kim, a structural geologist from the University of Montana, was contracted to conduct a field assessment. Kim spent 2 weeks in September of 2009 examining the mountain's geology. He collected rock samples, documented fracture patterns, and used ground-penetrating radar to image subsurface structures. His report, submitted in November, concluded no geological processes observed or inferred that would account for the reported elevation loss. Kim noted that the summit appeared stable. The rock was intact, showing normal weathering patterns. There were no voids, no collapse features, no signs of subsidence. He wrote, "If 33 feet of elevation has been lost, it has occurred without disturbing the mountain's visible structure." The USGS reviewed Kim's findings and issued a formal statement in January of 2010. The statement acknowledged the discrepancy and noted that historical elevation data may have been subject to systematic errors inherent in older surveying techniques. The updated elevation, 10,466 feet, was adopted as official. But Delacroix disagreed. In a letter to the review panel, he argued that triangulation surveys from 1901 through 1978 had used different equipment, different surveyors, and different methodologies. All had arrived at the same figure, 10,499 feet. The likelihood of systematic error across multiple independent surveys was negligible. He requested access to the original survey records from 1901. The USGS provided copies. Delacroix reviewed the field notes, calculations, and triangulation diagrams. The measurements were meticulous. The surveyors had established multiple reference points, cross-checked their work, and accounted for atmospheric refraction. Their figure of 10,499 feet was not an estimate. It was a precisely calculated value. Delacroix then examined the 1978 survey, the most recent prior to his own. The team had used electronic distance measurement, a precursor to GPS, combined with traditional leveling techniques. Their report included photographs of the summit, benchmark locations, and detailed elevation profiles. The summit elevation, 10,499 feet. The photographs showed the same rocky summit Delacroix had stood on in 2009. In March of 2010, Delacroix published an article in a geoscience journal outlining the discrepancy. He presented the historical data, his own measurements, and Kim's geological assessment. He concluded, Mount Cleveland has experienced an elevation loss of 33 feet between 1978 and 2009 through an unknown mechanism. The article received limited attention. One peer reviewer noted that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and suggested the discrepancy was more likely due to datum shifts or reference frame changes. Delacroix responded that all measurements had been corrected to the same vertical datum. The reviewer did not reply. In 2012, a graduate student named Priya Lagari attempted to resolve the mystery as part of her thesis on geodetic anomalies. She obtained archival aerial photographs of Mount Cleveland dating back to 1947 and compared them to recent satellite imagery. She measured the mountain's profile, summit dimensions, and topographic features across multiple decades. Her analysis found no visible changes. The mountain's shape was consistent. Lagari also analyzed elevation models derived from photogrammetry and LiDAR data. The models, created from overlapping aerial images, allowed for three-dimensional reconstruction of the terrain. Models from 1978 and 2009 both showed the summit at approximately the same position relative to surrounding features, but the absolute elevation had changed. Lagari's thesis advisor, Dr. Ramon Gutierrez, suggested the issue might be related to changes in the geoid, the mathematical model of Earth's shape used to define sea level. Shifts in the geoid could cause apparent elevation changes without physical movement. Lagari tested this hypothesis. The geoid had been refined multiple times since 1901, but the changes at Mount Cleveland's location amounted to less than 2 feet, not enough to account for 33 feet. Lagari's thesis was completed in 2013, but never published in a peer-reviewed journal. Gutierrez later said the findings raised more questions than they answered, and suggested further research was needed. In 2017, Delacroix returned to Mount Cleveland. With a team from the National Geodetic Survey, they conducted the most comprehensive elevation survey in the mountain's history, using multiple GPS receivers, laser ranging equipment, and photogrammetric analysis. The measurements, taken over a 4-day period, were processed with the latest geoid models and atmospheric corrections. The summit measured 10,451 feet, 15 feet lower than 2009, 48 feet lower than 1978, Delacroix's report, submitted to the USGS in October of 2017, noted, the elevation of Mount Cleveland continues to decrease. No geological or geodetic explanation has been identified. The report was reviewed internally, but not released publicly. A USGS spokesperson, when contacted by a journalist in 2018, stated that elevation measurements can vary due to a number of technical factors, and that the agency is committed to providing the most accurate data possible. When the journalist asked if the mountain was physically shrinking, the spokesperson said, "We cannot comment on ongoing research. No further official surveys have been conducted." The USGS website currently lists Mount Cleveland's elevation as 10,466 feet, the 2009 measurement. A footnote states, elevation subject to revision pending updated survey data. Delacroix retired in 2020. In a final interview with a geoscience publication, he was asked if he believed the elevation loss was real. He said, "I've measured that mountain 3 times, with equipment that doesn't lie. Each time, it was lower. I don't know where the elevation went. I don't know if it's still going. But the mountain is not the height we thought it was." When asked what he thought was happening, he paused. Then he said, "Mountains don't shrink. Not like this. Not without a trace. Mount Cleveland is still there. Climbers still attempt it. Maps still list its elevation, though the numbers vary depending on when the map was printed. And somewhere, in filing cabinets and digital archives, are measurements that don't agree a century of surveys that say the summit should be higher than it is, as if the mountain is sinking into itself, or into something else, slowly, silently, 33 feet at a time. Some places in the wilderness were built by hands no one remembers and refuse to stay where they're found. Hidden Lake sits in a glacial cirque, high above the Logan Pass Visitor Center in Glacier National Park, accessible by a steep 1.5-mile trail that climbs through alpine meadows and stunted whitebark pine. The lake is popular during summer months, drawing thousands of day hikers. But beyond the main overlook, away from the maintained trail, the terrain becomes rough and unmapped. Talus slopes descend into dense subalpine forest. Creek beds carve through willow thickets. Few people venture into these areas. No established campsites exist there. No trails are marked. Yet people keep finding one. The first documented report came in August of 2003. A solo backpacker named Victor Landry was hiking cross-country east of Hidden Lake, navigating by compass and topographic map. He planned to camp in a meadow he'd identified on the map, but as daylight faded, he realized he'd misjudged the terrain. The meadow was steeper and rockier than expected. He continued walking, searching for flat ground. At dusk, he found a campsite. It was fully established. A stone fire ring, neatly arranged, 2 cleared tent pads, leveled and free of debris, and a picnic table, weathered gray, positioned under a cluster of subalpine fir. The site looked old but maintained. Landry assumed it was a legacy site, an unofficial campsite used by locals or outfitters before the Park Service restricted backcountry camping to designated zones. He pitched his tent on one of the cleared pads and built a small fire in the ring. The stones were blackened with soot. The table was solid, hand-built from rough-cut planks. The joints fitted with wooden pegs instead of nails. He ate dinner, extinguished the fire, and went to sleep. The next morning, he woke to find the campsite gone, not abandoned, gone. He was lying in his tent in the middle of an uncleared patch of forest. The fire ring wasn't there. The table wasn't there. The tent pads weren't there. He stood up and looked around, disoriented. He checked his GPS unit, a basic handheld model he'd been using for navigation. The coordinates matched where he thought he'd camped, but there was no campsite. He walked in widening circles, searching. After 20 minutes, he found it 300 yards to the southeast, in a small clearing he hadn't noticed the night before. The fire ring, the table, the cleared tent pads, all exactly as they had been. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. He didn't understand. He checked his GPS again. The coordinates didn't match where he'd slept. Landry descended to the Logan Pass Visitor Center and asked a ranger about backcountry campsites near Hidden Lake. The ranger, a seasonal employee named Monica Vasquez, told him there were no established sites in that area. Landry described what he'd found. Vasquez made a note, but offered no explanation. Landry left the park that afternoon, unsettled, but attributing the experience to fatigue or disorientation. In July of 2006, a couple, Derek and Amanda Kowalczyk, were camping in the same general area. They were experienced backpackers, familiar with Glacier's backcountry. They had a permit for a designated site near Floral Park, but poor weather forced them to stop early. As they searched for shelter, they found the campsite. Fire ring, cleared pads, weathered table. Amanda photographed it. The images, time-stamped by her digital camera, show the site in detail. The table is rough-hewn, its surface scarred and darkened by years of exposure. The fire ring is composed of 9 stones, each blackened on the interior. The tent pads are flat and rectangular, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, cleared down to bare soil. They camped there that night. The next morning, Derek woke early and walked to a nearby creek to filter water. When he returned, Amanda was standing outside the tent, staring. The campsite had moved. The table was now 50 yards to the north, positioned under a different stand of trees. The fire ring was beside it. The tent pads were gone, replaced by uncleared forest floor. Derek didn't believe her until he saw it himself. They packed quickly and hiked out. At the ranger station, they reported the experience. The ranger on duty, A man named Leonard Ostrowski listened and filed a brief incident report. He suggested they had camped in two different locations and become confused. Amanda insisted they hadn't moved. She showed him the photographs. Ostrowski noted the inconsistency but took no further action. In 2009, a park maintenance crew was conducting a trail survey near Hidden Lake when they found the table. It was lying on its side in a drainage, partially buried in silt. The crew leader, a woman named Teresa Alvarez, recognized it as old, potentially historic. She photographed it and reported the find to the park's Cultural Resources Office. A specialist, Dr. Harold Kim, examined the photographs and requested the table be retrieved for analysis. The crew returned to the drainage 2 weeks later. The table was gone. They searched the area extensively. They found no evidence it had been removed, no drag marks, no footprints, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. Kim requested a follow-up search. In August of 2009, he hiked to the area with 2 assistants. They spent 3 days surveying the terrain, looking for the table or any remnants of the campsite. They found a fire ring 9 stones, heavily sooted in a location that didn't match the coordinates Alvarez had provided. The ring appeared old. Kim collected charcoal samples from the interior and sent them to a laboratory for carbon dating. The results, returned in October of 2009, indicated the charcoal was approximately 60 to 70 years old, consistent with fires from the 1940s or early 1950s. Kim noted this in his report, but could draw no conclusions. The fire ring predated the park's backcountry camping regulations. It could have been used by hikers, hunters, or Park Service personnel before designated campsites were established. But it didn't explain why the campsite seemed to move. In 2012, a graduate student named Elliot Greenberg was researching off-trail recreation patterns in Glacier. He interviewed dozens of backpackers who had camped in unmarked areas. 3 separate individuals mentioned finding the campsite near Hidden Lake. All described the same features: fire ring, table, cleared tent pads. All reported that the site appeared in a different location the next morning. Greenberg attempted to locate the site himself. He hiked the area in July of 2013 using GPS coordinates provided by the backpackers. He found nothing. He expanded his search radius, covering several square miles over 4 days. On the final day, he found the fire ring. He photographed it, marked the coordinates, and returned the next morning. The ring was gone. Greenberg contacted Kim, who agreed to join him for a follow-up expedition. In August of 2013, they returned to the area with handheld GPS units and a drone equipped with a camera. They located the fire ring in a clearing approximately half a mile from where Greenberg had found it the previous month. They documented it thoroughly: photographs, measurements, soil samples, and left a fluorescent marker on the table to track its position. They returned the next day. The marker was gone. The table was 200 yards to the west, positioned in a different clearing. The fire ring was beside it. The tent pads had reappeared, cleared and level. Kim collected additional charcoal samples. The carbon dating results were consistent with the previous samples, mid-20th century. He also collected wood samples from the table and sent them to a dendrochronology lab. The analysis indicated the wood was Douglas fir, cut sometime between 1935 and 1950. Kim submitted a formal report to the National Park Service in November of 2013. The report documented the findings and noted, the site appears to be a legacy campsite of unknown origin, possibly used by early park personnel or civilian crews. The apparent displacement of site features cannot be explained through conventional means. The NPS reviewed the report and classified the site as a potential cultural resource. In March of 2014, a team was dispatched to locate and assess the site for inclusion in the park's historic structures inventory. The team spent 5 days searching the area. They found no campsite, no table, no fire ring. A follow-up expedition in June of 2014 also found nothing. The site was listed as location unknown in park records. In 2017, a backpacker named Priya Laghari posted on a hiking forum about finding the campsite. She described it in detail and noted that it had moved overnight. Several forum members replied, sharing similar experiences. One user, Trailrunner83, wrote, "I found that table in 2010. Same thing happened. Thought I was losing my mind." Another user, Montana Ghost, replied, "Don't camp there. It doesn't want you to stay. No one knows who built the campsite. No park records document its construction. No historical accounts mention it. The table, if it still exists, is somewhere in the forest near Hidden Lake, appearing and disappearing according to rules no one understands. And the fire ring, with its 60-year-old charcoal, keeps showing up in places it wasn't the day before, as if the campsite is searching for something, or avoiding something, or simply refusing to be found twice in the same place." Some structures stand not because they were built to last, but because they refuse to fall. McDonald Creek flows through the heart of Glacier National Park, carving a valley between steep ridges covered in Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. The creek is accessible, popular with tourists who walk the Trail of the Cedars or drive the Going to the Sun road. But above the valley, where the terrain steepens and the forest thins, the land becomes vertical rock faces, scree slopes, and exposed ledges where only technical climbers venture. One of these ledges, approximately 2,000 feet above the creek, holds a cairn. Cairns are common in wilderness areas, stacked stones used as trail markers or summit indicators. They're usually small, 3 or 4 rocks high, built by hikers to mark a route or celebrate a climb. But the cairn above McDonald Creek is different. It stands 10 feet tall, composed of stones that range from the size of a bowling ball to that of a large suitcase. The stones are stacked in a column so narrow and precise that it appears structurally impossible. No mortar binds them. No support anchors them. The cairn simply stands, balanced on a ledge barely wider than its base, exposed to wind that regularly exceeds 50 miles per hour, and it has been there for at least a century. The earliest known photograph of the cairn was taken in 1924 by a geological survey team mapping the western slope of the park. The image, part of a larger collection archived by the U.S. Geological Survey, shows the cairn in the background of a landscape shot. The surveyor who took the photograph, a man named Arthur Pemberton, made no written note of it, but the cairn is visible, distinct, unmistakable, standing in the same position it occupies today. Earlier expedition records, including those from the Sperry Glacier surveys of 1902 and 1913, make no mention of the cairn. Photographs from those expeditions, taken from similar vantage points, show the ledge empty. If the cairn existed before 1924, no one documented it. The first person known to have reached the cairn was a climber named Victor Delgado in 1976. Delgado was attempting a solo ascent of a nearby ridge when he noticed the cairn from below. Intrigued, he diverted from his planned route and climbed to the ledge. The ascent required technical skill. The approach was steep, the rock loose, and the exposure severe. When he reached the cairn, he spent several minutes examining it. The stones were granite and limestone, consistent with the surrounding geology. They showed no tool marks, no evidence of shaping or carving. The stack was slightly tapered, narrower at the top than the base, but not enough to explain its stability. Delgado tested it by pressing against the lowest stones. The cairn didn't shift. He took several photographs, including close-ups of the stone joints. In his climbing journal, he wrote, "The cairn defies explanation. The balance is perfect, but the stones are irregular. I don't know how it stands, or who built it, or why. The ledge offers nothing, no view, no strategic value, no reason to be here. But someone went to significant effort to place these stones. Delgado also noted something else. He wrote, "I felt unwelcome. Not threatened, exactly, but observed. I stayed only 10 minutes before descending. I had no rational reason to leave, but I couldn't remain." In 1988, two climbers, Sandra Miyamoto and Leonard Finch, reached the cairn during an exploration of unclimbed routes above McDonald Creek. They had read Delgado's account and wanted to see the cairn for themselves. They documented it with photographs and measurements. The cairn stood 10 feet 2 inches tall. The base stone was embedded slightly in the soil, providing minimal stability. The remaining stones were stacked without visible mortar or adhesive. Miyamoto attempted to calculate the cairn's center of gravity. Based on the size and shape of the stones, the structure should have been unstable, top-heavy, vulnerable to wind, prone to collapse. Yet it stood. She noted in her field report, "The cairn's stability is inconsistent with conventional structural analysis. It should not be possible." Finch experienced the same sensation Delgado had described. He wrote, "We climbed 3 hours to reach the ledge. We stayed less than 15 minutes. Both of us felt the need to leave. Not fear, but discomfort. As if we were intruding." In 1993, the National Park Service commissioned a study of historical structures in Glacier, including unofficial cairns and markers. A researcher named Dr. Ellen Travers reviewed archival photographs and climbing reports. She identified the cairn above McDonald Creek as a structure of interest and recommended a site visit. Travers reached the cairn in August of 1993, accompanied by a climbing guide named Ramon Silva. They documented the cairn with video footage, detailed measurements, and 360-degree photography. Travers collected lichen samples from the stones to estimate the cairn's age. Lichen grows slowly in alpine environments, typically 1 millimeter per year or less. The colonies on the cairn stones were extensive, suggesting the structure had been in place for decades, possibly a century or more. Travers also noted the cairn's shadow. At midday, when the sun was directly overhead, the cairn cast a shadow that didn't align with the sun's position. The discrepancy was subtle, a matter of degrees, but measurable. She photographed the shadow multiple times and compared it to known sun angles. The shadow consistently pointed slightly east of where it should have, as if the cairn were leaning, though visual inspection showed it standing perfectly vertical. Silva, the guide, experienced the same discomfort others had reported. He later told Travers, "I've climbed all over this park. I've been in worse places, higher places, more exposed places, but that ledge felt wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder. I kept feeling like someone was behind me. There was no one." Travers submitted her report to the NPS in October of 1993. The report included the lichen dating results, which suggested the cairn was at least 70 to 80 years old, consistent with construction sometime in the early 1900s. She recommended further study, including structural analysis and historical research, to identify the builder. The recommendation was noted but not pursued. In a memo dated December of 1993, the regional NPS director stated, "The cairn does not pose a safety hazard and is located in an area rarely accessed by the public. No further action is warranted at this time." Travers disagreed. She attempted to publish her findings in a journal focused on historical preservation. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that without documentation of the cairn's origin, the study offered limited historical value. One reviewer suggested the cairn might be a modern construction, despite the lichen evidence. In 2006, a photographer named Marcus Beaulieu was documenting Glacier's backcountry for a conservation project. He learned about the cairn from climbing forums and decided to photograph it. He reached the ledge in September of 2006, using a drone to capture aerial footage. The drone footage, later posted online, shows the cairn from above. The stones are stacked in a precise column, each balanced on the one below. The structure is narrower than it appears, from the ground less than 2 feet in diameter at its widest point. The ledge it stands on is exposed, with sheer drops on three sides. Wind is visible in the footage, bending the sparse vegetation around the cairn. The cairn doesn't move. Beaulieu also used long-exposure photography to capture the cairn at night. The images show star trails arcing across the sky. The cairn is silhouetted against the stars, perfectly still. But in one image, taken with a 30-minute exposure, the cairn's shadow appears in two places, one cast by moonlight, the other by starlight. The shadows don't align. Beaulieu later wrote, "I've photographed a lot of strange places. The cairn is the only one that made me feel watched. I set up my camera and walked away to avoid disturbing the shot. When I came back, I had the distinct impression someone had been standing where I'd been standing. No footprints, no evidence, just a feeling." In 2011, a team of structural engineers from the University of Montana was contracted by a climbing magazine to analyze the cairn as part of a feature on impossible structures. The team included Dr. Patricia O'Malley, a specialist in structural mechanics. She reviewed photographs, measurements, and video footage, but declined to visit the site in person. Her analysis, published in the magazine, concluded, "The cairn's stability cannot be explained by conventional engineering principles. The stones are not fitted, mortared, or braced. The structure is exposed to high winds and freeze-thaw cycles. It should have collapsed decades ago." When asked what kept it standing, O'Malley said, "I don't know. I can tell you what should happen. I can't tell you what is happening. The cairn is still there. Climbers still reach it occasionally, perhaps a dozen people per decade. Most report the same sensation: discomfort, the urge to leave, the feeling of being observed. None have reported the cairn moving or falling. No storms have toppled it. No earthquakes have dislodged it." In 2019, a long-exposure photograph taken from a nearby ridge showed something unusual. The image, captured during a full moon, shows the cairn's shadow stretching across the ledge. But the shadow is longer than it should be, as if cast by a structure taller than 10 feet. The photographer, a woman named Chloe Baxter, checked her camera settings. The exposure was correct. The angle was correct. The shadow was wrong. She posted the image online. One commenter wrote, "Shadows don't lie. Either the cairn is taller than it looks, or it's casting something else's shadow." No one knows who built the cairn. No one knows how it stands. And no one who has reached it can stay long enough to find out why. Because the ledge above McDonald Creek doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied. And the cairn, balanced impossibly on stone, stands like a marker or a warning